Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Mirror of Hours Yet to Come, from Marcus Chen. The rain had been my companion for 300 miles, drumming against the windshield of my Peterbilt in a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. I'd been driving the western corridors for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the lonely stretches between Seattle and Los Angeles. But I'd never experienced anything quite like what happened during that October run. The memory still makes my hands tremble when I grip the steering wheel. Still makes me question everything I thought I knew about time and the roads that snake through our world like arteries, carrying secrets we're not meant to discover. It started when I picked up the new dash cam system at a truck stop outside Portland. The kid working the electronics counter couldn't have been more than 19, with fingers stained black from handling components and eyes that seemed to hold more knowledge than someone his age should possess. He'd recommended the rear-facing camera setup with an enthusiasm that made me slightly uncomfortable, his voice dropping to almost a whisper as he explained its features. The system included a high-definition rear camera that would record everything happening behind my trailer, feeding the footage to a small monitor mounted just above my CB radio. Nothing unusual about that, he'd said, except this particular model had some special recording capabilities that would help me see things I might otherwise miss. I installed it that evening at a rest stop 20 miles down the highway, following the surprisingly simple instructions while the rain continued its relentless percussion against my cab. The camera mounted easily to the back of my trailer, a sleek black eye that would watch the road disappearing behind me as I rolled toward my destination in Bakersfield. The monitor flickered to life as I started the engine, showing a clear view of the wet asphalt stretching away into darkness, illuminated by my taillights like a river of blood flowing backward through time. The image quality was remarkably sharp, sharper than anything I'd used before, capturing details I would never have noticed in my mirrors alone. For the first 100 miles, everything seemed perfectly normal. The camera faithfully recorded the occasional car passing me, their headlights cutting through the rain like fallen stars, and the endless parade of white and yellow lines that marked the boundaries of my world. I found myself glancing at the monitor more frequently than necessary, oddly fascinated by this new perspective on the journey I'd traveled countless times before. There was something hypnotic about watching the road flow away from me, seeing the path I'd just traveled recede into the distance like memories fading into the subconscious mind. But as I crossed into California, something began to feel different about the footage. The timestamp in the corner of the monitor showed the correct time, but occasionally I would catch glimpses of things that didn't quite match what I remembered passing. A green sedan that I was certain had been blue when it overtook me. A billboard advertising a restaurant that I could have sworn had been promoting a gas station when I'd noticed it in my side mirror. Small discrepancies that I attributed to fatigue and the disorienting effects of staring at screens for too long, but which gradually accumulated into a persistent sense of unease that settled in my chest like cold fog. The first truly unsettling incident occurred around midnight, as I was climbing through the Grapevine Pass. I had just overtaken a slower truck, a battered Kenworth pulling a refrigerated trailer, and settled back into the right lane when I glanced at the rear camera monitor. The Kenworth was there, following at a safe distance, but something was wrong with the image. The truck appeared to be slightly transparent, as if the camera were somehow seeing through it to capture the road surface beneath. More disturbing still, the driver's cab seemed to be empty, though I had clearly seen an elderly man with a gray beard sitting behind the wheel when I'd passed him. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the image remained the same, showing a ghost truck piloted by no one, following me through the California mountains like a phantom from some automotive purgatory. I convinced myself it was a technical glitch, perhaps caused by the rain or electromagnetic interference from the mountains, but the explanation felt hollow even as I tried to accept it. The Kenworth eventually took an exit, fading from my monitor like smoke dissipating in the wind, and I was alone again with the rain and the darkness and the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with my new electronic companion. The camera continued to show me things that didn't quite align with my other observations. Subtle differences that made me question my own perception and wonder if I was beginning to lose the sharp awareness that had kept me safe on these roads for so many years. As dawn approached, still hours away but marked by the faintest lightening of the eastern sky, the anomalies became more pronounced and impossible to ignore. The monitor showed 3 cars following me in a neat formation, their headlights creating a constellation of light in the pre-dawn gloom. But my mirrors reflected an empty highway stretching back toward the mountains. When I looked directly over my shoulder through the rear window of my cab, I saw nothing but darkness and rain. Yet the camera insisted that these vehicles were there, maintaining perfect spacing as they shadowed my progress toward Bakersfield. The cars appeared to be older models, designs from the 70s and 80s that looked somehow pristine despite their age, as if they had been preserved in some temporal bubble and released onto highways that existed parallel to but separate from the world I knew. The truth began to dawn on me gradually, like the approaching sunrise that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I started paying closer attention to the timestamp on the monitor, comparing it to the digital clock on my dashboard and the time display on my phone. At first, the differences were small, just a few minutes here and there, but as I continued driving, the gap began to widen. The camera's timestamp was moving forward faster than real time, gradually pulling ahead of the present moment and showing me images from a future that hadn't yet arrived. By the time I reached the outskirts of Bakersfield, the monitor was displaying footage from nearly an hour in the future, revealing events that wouldn't occur for another 60 minutes of driving. The implications hit me like a physical blow, making my hands shake on the steering wheel and my vision blur with a mixture of fear and fascination. I was seeing myself arrive at my destination before I had actually gotten there, watching my own truck navigate streets I hadn't yet reached and back into loading docks I hadn't yet found. The camera showed me making turns I hadn't planned, taking routes I hadn't chosen, following a predetermined path through a future that seemed as fixed and immutable as the past. I saw myself completing the delivery, shaking hands with the warehouse manager, filling out paperwork that documented transactions that existed only in the electronic dreams of a machine that somehow peered through the veil of time itself. But the most terrifying revelation came when I realized that the future the camera showed me wasn't necessarily the future I was going to experience. As I approached the warehouse district, I began to notice discrepancies between what the monitor displayed and the choices I was making in real time. The camera showed me turning left at an intersection where I had decided to turn right. It displayed my truck backing into Bay 7 when I had received instructions to use Bay 4. The future it revealed was a future, not the future, one possible timeline among infinite variations that branched and merged like the highway system itself, creating a network of potential realities that existed simultaneously in some dimension beyond human understanding. I tried to follow the path the camera had shown me, curious to see if I could align my present actions with its prophetic display. But every choice I made seemed to create new divergences, new possibilities that spawned their own timelines and their own visions of what might come to pass. The camera adapted instantly, updating its prophetic display to reflect the consequences of my decisions, showing me futures that shifted and changed like smoke in the wind, never quite stable, never quite certain, always revealing new possibilities that branched away from the choices I was making in real time. The delivery itself passed in a blur of surreal disconnection, as I found myself simultaneously experiencing the present moment and watching it unfold on the monitor before it happened. I signed documents I had already seen myself sign, spoke words I had already heard myself speak, moved through a choreographed dance of predetermined actions that felt both inevitable and completely foreign. The warehouse workers seemed unaware that anything unusual was occurring, going about their business with the casual efficiency of people who existed firmly rooted in a single timeline, blissfully ignorant of the temporal chaos swirling around them like an invisible storm. By the time I finished the delivery and prepared to leave Bakersfield, the camera was showing me footage from nearly 2 hours in the future, revealing a version of myself driving north through the Central Valley, under an afternoon sun that wouldn't appear for many hours yet. I watched myself stop for fuel at a truck stop I had never seen before, watched myself have conversations with people I had never met, watched myself navigate through situations that felt simultaneously familiar and impossible. The future self on the monitor moved with a confidence and knowledge that I didn't possess, making decisions based on information that hadn't yet been revealed to me, following some script that existed beyond the boundaries of linear time, the voice that wasn't there. From Marcus Chen, I've been driving 18-wheelers for nearly 2 decades now, hauling freight across the lonesome highways that stretch between cities like dark ribbons under starless skies. In all those years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379, I thought I'd encountered every kind of passenger the road could offer. Hitchhikers with stories that didn't quite add up, desperate souls fleeing troubles they wouldn't name, and the occasional drifter who paid for rides with crumpled bills that smelled of cigarettes and regret. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the woman I picked up outside Bakersfield on that fog-shrouded October night. The marine layer had rolled in thick as cotton batting, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. My headlights cut through the mist like butter knives through cream, illuminating patches of asphalt that seemed to float in an endless gray void. The radio crackled with static between stations, and the rhythmic thump of my wipers against the windshield had become a hypnotic metronome marking time in this surreal landscape. I was hauling computer components to Seattle, running behind schedule because of construction delays in Los Angeles, when I saw her silhouette wavering in the fog like a mirage. She stood perfectly still beside the on-ramp, one pale arm extended with her thumb raised in the universal gesture of need. Her dark coat hung loose around her slight frame, and even through the thick fog I could see that she was soaked through, her hair plastered against her skull like seaweed. Something about her posture struck me as oddly formal, as if she were posing for an old photograph rather than flagging down a ride. But the sight of anyone standing alone in this ghostly weather tugged at whatever remained of my better angels, so I downshifted and brought the big rig to a hissing stop about 20 feet ahead of where she waited. Through my side mirror, I watched her approach with measured steps that seemed to glide rather than walk across the wet pavement. She moved without the hurried desperation I'd come to expect from hitchhikers, displaying instead a strange, dreamlike grace that made the fog swirl around her in hypnotic patterns. When she reached the passenger door, she stood motionless for several heartbeats before raising her hand to knock. The sound that reached my ears wasn't the solid rap of knuckles against metal, but something softer, more like fingertips brushing against glass. I leaned across the cab to open the door, and the dome light flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance independently of their sources. The woman who climbed into my truck appeared to be in her 30s, with pale skin that held an almost translucent quality, and dark eyes that reflected the dashboard lights like still water under a full moon. Her clothes were indeed saturated with moisture, yet somehow no water dripped onto my upholstery, as if the dampness simply stopped at the boundary of her being. "Thank you," she said, settling into the passenger seat with fluid movements that reminded me uncomfortably of someone sinking beneath the surface of a lake. Her voice carried an odd quality that I couldn't immediately identify, something hollow and distant, as if her words were traveling through a long tunnel before reaching my ears. "I need to reach Portland. Portland's a bit out of my way," I replied, engaging the clutch and easing the truck back onto the highway. "But I can get you as far as Salem if that helps." The fog seemed to grow thicker as we rolled forward, my headlights now penetrating only 15 feet or so into the gray murk that surrounded us like a living thing. The familiar weight of the trailer behind me felt somehow different, as if the cargo had shifted or multiplied during our brief stop. though I knew that was impossible. My passenger nodded once, a movement so subtle I might have imagined it, and then fell silent. The cab filled with the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of fog sliding past the windows like ghostly fingers. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two, as we navigated the invisible highway guided only by the occasional appearance of reflective lane markers and the vague sense of pavement beneath our wheels. The radio had given up entirely, producing nothing but white noise that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my passenger's barely audible breathing. Quite a night for traveling, I ventured, hoping to break the increasingly oppressive silence that had settled over us like a burial shroud. The woman turned her head toward me, and in the green glow of the dashboard instruments, her features appeared to shift and blur as if viewed through moving water. When she spoke, that peculiar hollow quality in her voice had become more pronounced, as if the words were echoing up from the bottom of a well. "I've been traveling for a very long time," she replied, and something in her tone made the hair on my forearm stand upright. "Roads like this one, in weather like this, always moving, never quite arriving." Her fingers, I noticed, left no condensation on the window when she traced absent patterns on the glass, despite the obvious moisture that clung to her clothing like morning dew on spider webs. As we climbed into the hills north of the Central Valley, the fog began to take on strange properties that defied my experience with such weather phenomena. Instead of thinning with altitude as it should have, the mist grew denser, more substantial, until it seemed we were driving through clouds of gray cotton that pressed against the windshield with almost physical weight. The wipers struggled against moisture that felt thick as syrup, leaving smears rather than clearing the glass, and I found myself leaning forward and squinting to make out even the closest road markers. "Perhaps you should pull over," my passenger suggested, her hollow voice now carrying an undertone that resonated strangely in my chest cavity. "This weather is becoming quite dangerous." But even as she spoke these words of apparent concern, I caught something in her reflection in the side window that made my blood feel suddenly cold in my veins. Her image appeared fragmented, broken into pieces like a reflection in shattered mirror, and when I glanced directly at her, she seemed more solid, more present than she had when she first climbed into the cab. The truck's engine began to develop an irregular rhythm, coughing and stuttering in ways that it had never done in all my years of faithful service. The fog outside had become so thick that it appeared almost luminous, glowing with its own pale inner light that turned the world beyond my windshield into an endless void of shifting gray-white substance. When I tried the radio again, hoping to pick up weather reports or road conditions, the only sound that emerged from the speakers was a low, resonant humming that seemed to match the hollow timbre of my passenger's voice. Mile markers became impossible to read through the supernatural thickness of the fog, and I began to suspect that we had somehow left the ordinary highway behind and entered some parallel route that existed in the spaces between normal geography. The sensation of my trailer's weight had grown increasingly strange, as if the cargo was not only shifting but transforming into something altogether different from the electronic components I had loaded in Los Angeles. Each time I checked my mirrors, the darkness behind us seemed more complete, more absolute, as if we were towing a piece of the void itself down this phantom road. "You feel it too, don't you?" my passenger asked, turning those dark, reflecting eyes toward me once again. The hollow quality of her voice had grown so pronounced that her words seemed to arrive several seconds after her lips moved, creating a disconnect between sound and vision that made my head spin with vertigo. The way the road changes when the fog comes down like this. The way distance becomes meaningless, and destinations slip away like water through cupped fingers. My hands began to tremble against the steering wheel. As the full implications of her words settled into my consciousness like stones sinking through dark water, the dashboard clock had stopped working entirely, its digital display showing only a series of blinking dashes. And when I tried to calculate how long we had been driving, I discovered that time itself seemed to have become as fluid and unreliable as everything else in this fog-shrouded nightmare. The familiar landmarks that should have guided our progress north had vanished completely, replaced by an endless tunnel of gray mist that stretched infinitely in all directions. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears, as if the cab of my truck had become an echo chamber filled with thick, muffling air. Her smile in response was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed, not because it was cruel or menacing, but because it was empty, devoid of the warmth and life that should animate human expressions. "I am the passenger who rides the fog roads," she replied, her hollow voice now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am the one who helps drivers find their way to destinations they never knew they were seeking. You've been driving alone for so long, Marcus, moving cargo from place to place without ever truly arriving anywhere that matters. Don't you think it's time to discover where you really belong? The nursery route." From Marcus Chen, the engine of my Peterbilt 379 had been making that sound for 3 weeks now, ever since I picked up the rig from the maintenance shop in Bakersfield. At first, I thought it was just air in the cooling system, maybe a loose belt or worn bearing, but the mechanics swore they'd checked everything twice. The sound wasn't mechanical, though, not really. It was organic, wet, like something alive was living deep in the heart of my truck's diesel engine, gurgling and cooing with each revolution of the crankshaft. I'd been driving the interstate highways for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to livestock, and I knew every sound a truck could make. This wasn't one of them. When I pressed the accelerator climbing through the Tehachapi Pass, the engine would respond with what sounded exactly like a baby's contented gurgle, the kind of sound infants make when they're drifting off to sleep after a feeding. When I downshifted for the steep grades, it would coo and bubble, almost musical in its cadence. The other drivers at the truck stop started to notice. Big Jim from Texas asked me about it at a Flying J outside of Flagstaff. Said it sounded like I had a passenger up front. I laughed it off, told him it was just a quirky engine, but the comment stuck with me as I rolled through the Arizona desert that night. The sound seemed louder in the darkness, more pronounced when the radio was off and the highway stretched empty ahead of my headlights. It was near Gallup, New Mexico, that I first noticed the pattern. The gurgling would intensify whenever I passed certain mile markers, specific exit signs, particular stretches of road that seemed no different from any others. I started keeping a log, marking down the locations where the sound grew strongest, and after a week of careful documentation, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Every location corresponded to a spot where, according to my GPS and online searches, there had been accidents involving families, specifically accidents where children had been involved. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the desert night air. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that I was reading patterns into randomness the way people see faces in clouds or hear voices in white noise. But the sound was so unmistakably infant-like, so perfectly timed to these tragic locations, that my rational mind began to war with something deeper and more primitive. I decided to test my theory on a lonely stretch of Interstate 40 between Albuquerque and Santa Rosa. According to news archives, I'd found at a truck stop with Wi-Fi. A family of 4 had died there 18 months earlier, when their minivan crossed the median during a summer thunderstorm. The children had been twins, barely 8 months old. I approached the area just after midnight, the highway empty except for the occasional semi in the distance, their lights like lonely stars in the vast New Mexico darkness. As I neared the mile marker where the accident had occurred, the engine's gurgling intensified dramatically. It was no longer just a sound. It was a symphony of infant voices cooing and bubbling with what seemed like recognition or perhaps longing. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the sound filled the cab, seeming to come not just from the engine compartment but from the very air around me. The truck's interior lights flickered briefly, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement in my peripheral vision, like small shadows playing across the passenger seat. I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to leave that stretch of highway behind, But the engine sound followed me for miles, gradually fading to its usual background gurgle only when I was well past the accident site. Sleep eluded me at the next truck stop, and I found myself researching the phenomenon online, searching for any explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. Mechanical resonance, acoustic pareidolia, stress-induced auditory hallucinations, anything that could provide a rational framework for what I was experiencing. But the evidence kept mounting. Near Amarillo, the engine sang its liquid lullaby passing the site where a school bus had skidded off an icy overpass 5 years earlier. Outside of Oklahoma City, it gurgled with renewed intensity near an intersection where a drunk driver had claimed 3 young lives. Each location brought the same response, the same unmistakable sound of infants cooing in impossible harmony with my diesel engine's rhythm. The worst incident happened on a foggy night outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. I was hauling a load of furniture to Memphis, running behind schedule and fighting to stay alert after 14 hours on the road. The fog had rolled in thick from the Arkansas River, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet beyond my headlights. That's when the engine sound changed completely, becoming not just louder but more urgent, more demanding of attention. The gurgling rose to an almost singing quality, and I realized with growing horror that it was trying to communicate something. The rhythm of the sound was deliberate, pulsing in patterns that seemed to match the white lines disappearing under my truck. I checked my GPS and saw that I was approaching an area where, according to a quick online search, a daycare van had been involved in a multi-vehicle accident during similar fog conditions 3 years earlier. 7 children had died, ranging in age from 6 months to 3 years. As I entered what I now knew was the accident zone, my truck began to behave strangely. The steering felt loose, unresponsive, as if invisible hands were fighting me for control. The engine's gurgling became almost frantic, rising and falling in waves that seemed to pulse with urgency. Through the fog, I began to see lights that didn't belong, carnival colors swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The radio crackled to life despite being turned off, filling the cab with static that gradually resolved into what sounded like children's laughter. Faint and ethereal, but unmistakably real. The fog outside began to thin in places, creating windows of clarity that revealed scenes that couldn't possibly exist. I saw playground equipment rusted and overgrown, empty swings moving in no wind, a daycare sign weathered and tilted at an impossible angle right there beside the interstate. My truck began to slow despite my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator. The engine gurgled louder now, almost pleading, and I realized with crystalline clarity that it was trying to pull me off the road, trying to guide me toward whatever existed in that impossible space glimpsed through the fog. The steering wheel grew warm under my hands, then almost hot, and I could feel the truck being drawn inexorably toward the right shoulder. Fighting every instinct that screamed at me to surrender control, I yanked the wheel hard to the left and floored the accelerator. The engine responded with what sounded like a cry of disappointment, a wail that seemed to come from multiple voices in harmony. The fog swirled angrily around the truck, and for a terrifying moment I drove blind, seeing nothing but gray-white opacity in every direction. Then suddenly I was through it, emerging into clear night air with the lights of Little Rock visible in the distance. My hands shook as I pulled into the first truck stop I could find, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the parking lot, everything seemed normal again. My engine idled with its usual diesel rumble, though I could still detect that underlying gurgle that had started this whole nightmare. I called the maintenance shop the next morning, desperate to have the engine torn down and rebuilt, but they insisted there was nothing wrong. Every diagnostic test came back normal, every component within specifications, yet the gurgling persisted, and with it my growing certainty that I was carrying passengers I couldn't see, children who had found some way to attach themselves to my truck during its passage through places where innocence had been tragically cut short. Now, months later, I've learned to live with the sound. I've mapped out routes that avoid the worst locations, though sometimes the cargo demands I take roads where the engine's strange passenger manifest makes itself known. On quiet nights, when the highway stretches empty ahead and the gurgling rises to its gentle lullaby rhythm, I find myself talking to them, these small spirits who seem to have claimed my truck as their eternal school bus. I tell them about the places we're passing, describe the sunrise over the Rockies or the way city lights look like fallen stars from the interstate. Sometimes I swear the engine responds, gurgling in patterns that sound almost like contentment. And sometimes in my rear-view mirror in the darkest hours before dawn, I catch glimpses of small faces reflected in the glass, watching the road disappear behind us with wide, wondering eyes. The mechanics still insist there's nothing wrong with my engine, and maybe they're right. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed, only accepted and carried forward into whatever strange territories exist between the world of the living and wherever lost children go to dream. The Shrinking Highway, from Dale Morrison. The CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my Kenworth W900, watching the mile markers tick by on Interstate 80 somewhere between Salt Lake City and Reno. It was just past midnight on a Tuesday in October, and the desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the asphalt ribbon that cut through the darkness like a scar. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the western states, and I knew every truck stop, every mountain pass, every speed trap between here and the coast. The familiar hum of the diesel engine beneath me was a comfort, a steady heartbeat that had lulled me through countless nights just like this one. The temperature gauge read normal, fuel was 3/4 full, and my logbook showed I had another 4 hours before I'd need to pull over for my mandatory rest period. Everything was routine, predictable, safe. The kind of night where you could let your mind wander while your hands and feet worked on autopilot, following the white lines that disappeared beneath your bumper in an endless parade of reflected light from the headlamps. I'd passed the last truck stop about 40 miles back, and according to my atlas, the next services wouldn't appear for another 60 miles or so. That's when I noticed something odd about the mile markers. I'd just passed mile marker 247, and my odometer showed I'd traveled exactly 1 mile when the next marker came into view. But this one read 246 just as it should. Nothing unusual there. I continued on, watching the desert landscape roll by in the amber glow of my running lights, listening to the steady rhythm of rubber on asphalt and the occasional whistle of wind around the cab. The next mile marker appeared right on schedule, but something about it made me glance twice at my odometer. I'd traveled another full mile according to my instruments, but the marker read 244. I rubbed my eyes and checked my mirrors, scanning for other traffic, but the highway was completely empty in both directions. Sometimes fatigue could play tricks on your perception, make you misread signs or lose track of distance. I'd experienced that before during long hauls, especially on these lonely desert stretches where the monotony could lull your brain into a kind of waking sleep. But my odometer was digital, precise, and it clearly showed that I'd covered 2 miles since marker 247, so the progression from 247 to 246 to 244 was mathematically impossible. The next marker should have read 243, and when it appeared in my headlights exactly 1 mile later according to my odometer, that's exactly what it said. I felt a small wave of relief wash over me, convinced that I had simply misread the previous marker in the darkness. But that relief evaporated when the following marker read 241, then 238, then 234. Each time, my odometer confirmed that I'd traveled precisely 1 mile, but the markers were showing gaps of 2, 3, then 4-mile increments. I reached for the CB radio and keyed the microphone, broadcasting on channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Breaker 19, this is Big Blue Kenworth eastbound on I-80 near mile marker 234, looking for a radio check. Static filled the cab for several seconds before I tried again. Any drivers out there on 80 eastbound? This is Big Blue looking for anyone who might be seeing some strange mile markers out here. Nothing but empty static replied, which was unusual for this stretch of highway. Even late at night, there was usually some chatter from long-haul drivers pushing through to make their delivery schedules. The progression continued to accelerate with each passing mile. 234 to 228 to 220 to 209. My fuel gauge hadn't moved, my engine temperature remained steady, and my driving time continued to accumulate normally on the electronic logbook system. But according to the mile markers, I was somehow covering increasing distances with each measured mile that my truck actually traveled. It was as if the highway itself was contracting ahead of me, compressing space in a way that violated every law of physics I could remember from high school. I tried calling my dispatch on the company radio, but received only static there as well. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't entirely unusual in this remote part of Nevada, but the timing made me increasingly uneasy. The desert landscape outside my windows began to look different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The sagebrush and Joshua trees seemed closer to the highway than before, and the mountains on the distant horizon appeared to be moving imperceptibly closer with each mile that passed. By the time I reached what should have been mile marker 195, the progression had become truly alarming. The markers now read 195, then 185, then 170, then 150. I was somehow covering 15 measured miles for every actual mile my truck traveled, and the landscape was definitely changing. The desert vegetation was growing thicker and taller, crowding closer to the road surface. Rock formations that had been distant silhouettes were now looming prominently on both sides of the highway. Most disturbingly, the highway itself seemed to be narrowing. When I'd started this strange journey, Interstate 80 had been its standard width with broad shoulders and a comfortable median strip. But now the shoulders were noticeably narrower, and I could swear that the lanes themselves had shrunk. My mirrors, which normally cleared the white lines by several feet on each side, were now much closer to the lane boundaries. I found myself gripping the steering wheel more tightly, making constant small adjustments to keep the massive truck centered in what seemed to be a steadily constricting corridor. The mile markers continued their impossible countdown. 150 to 130 to 105 to 75. With each transition, the highway grew narrower and the landscape pressed closer. Trees that I didn't remember seeing in this part of Nevada began appearing alongside the road, their branches reaching out over the pavement like gnarled fingers trying to brush the top of my trailer. The asphalt beneath my wheels remained smooth and well-maintained, but the white and yellow lines that marked the lanes were now so close that I had to slow down to avoid crossing them. At what the markers claimed was mile 50, though I'd only traveled about 30 actual miles since this began, the highway had become little more than a two-lane road with no shoulders at all. Dense forest pressed against both edges of the pavement, and I could hear branches scraping against the sides of my trailer despite my careful driving. The speedometer showed I was doing barely 25 miles per hour, the maximum I dared attempt on what had become an impossibly narrow corridor through vegetation that shouldn't have existed in the Nevada desert. My heart was pounding now, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool October air conditioning. Every instinct told me to turn around, to somehow reverse course and get back to the normal highway I knew had to exist behind me. But when I checked my mirrors, I could see that the road behind was just as narrow as the path ahead, hemmed in by the same impossible forest that blocked any chance of turning around a 75-foot truck and trailer combination. The mile markers now showed 35, then 20, then 10, and I realized with growing horror that I was approaching some kind of endpoint to this shrinking highway. At mile marker 5, the road had become so narrow that my mirrors were folding back against the cab as branches pressed against them. The forest canopy had closed overhead, turning my headlights into narrow beams that barely penetrated the green tunnel that enclosed the impossible road. Mile marker 3 appeared, then 2, then 1, and I could see ahead to where the road simply ended at a wall of trees so thick that not even the narrow gap I'd been following continued through them. I pressed the brake pedal, feeling the air brakes hiss as the massive truck began to slow. There was nowhere to go, no way to turn around, and no explanation for how a major interstate highway could have compressed itself into this claustrophobic tunnel through a forest that had no business existing in the Nevada desert. But as my truck rolled to a complete stop just yards from the wall of trees ahead, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, barely visible in the shadows beyond my headlights, was mile marker 0. And beyond that, carved into the massive trunk of an ancient pine tree, was a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Interstate 80 West. Have a safe journey." The forest ahead began to thin, and I could see normal highway pavement continuing into the distance, under what looked like familiar desert starlight. Eased off the brake and let the truck creep forward through what should have been an impossible gap between the trees. As I passed the wooden sign, the forest fell away on both sides, and I found myself back on a normal 4-lane interstate highway with proper shoulders and median strips. My mirrors automatically folded back into their normal positions, and the familiar desert landscape spread out under the Nevada sky. The mile marker ahead read 1, then 2, then 3, as if I was just beginning the same journey I thought I'd been completing. The watching booth. From Marcus Chen, the interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the October moon, and I'd been driving the same route between Portland and Sacramento for nearly 15 years. My Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I settled into that meditative rhythm that only long-haul truckers truly understand, where the road becomes an extension of yourself and the miles blur together in a hypnotic dance of headlights and highway markers. The radio crackled softly with late-night chatter from other drivers, their voices distant companions in the darkness. But tonight something felt different about the familiar stretch of Highway 5 that wound through the Cascade foothills. The weather had been crisp and clear when I'd left Portland just after midnight, but now a thin fog was beginning to creep across the asphalt, not thick enough to slow me down, but present enough to soften the edges of the landscape and give everything an ethereal quality that made me grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. My headlights carved through the mist, illuminating the reflective paint on the guardrails that seemed to glow like phosphorescent bones in the darkness, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently than usual, though I couldn't say exactly why. I'd been making good time, running about 30 minutes ahead of schedule, when I saw the toll plaza materializing through the fog ahead of me, its overhead lights casting an amber glow that seemed to pulse gently in the misty air. This was unusual because I'd driven this route countless times, and there had never been a toll booth on this particular stretch of highway. But fatigue can play tricks on a driver's mind, and I figured maybe they'd installed it recently as part of some infrastructure improvement project that I'd somehow missed hearing about on the CB or in the trucking newsletters. As I downshifted and began to slow my 18-wheeler, the air brakes releasing their characteristic hiss, I could see that the toll plaza was oddly constructed, with only a single lane open, despite there being what appeared to be 6 or 7 booth structures stretching across the highway. The architecture was strange, too. More like something you'd find on an old European bridge than a modern American interstate, with stonework that seemed to absorb the yellow light rather than reflect it, giving the entire structure an ancient, weathered appearance that felt completely out of place in the Oregon wilderness. The toll booth itself was a small, narrow building barely wide enough for the single window that faced the approaching traffic, and as I rolled closer, my headlights illuminating more details, I noticed that the stonework around the window was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing shadows cast by the overhead lights. The fog swirled around the structure in ways that defied the gentle breeze I could feel through my partially opened window, creating spirals and eddies that reminded me uncomfortably of cigarette smoke in a closed room. I pulled up to the booth and set my air brake, the familiar mechanical sounds echoing strangely in the muffled atmosphere created by the fog, and waited for the toll collector to appear at the window. The silence stretched longer than it should have, broken only by the steady rumble of my idling engine and the soft whisper of mist against my windshield, and I began to wonder if the booth was automated or if perhaps the attendant had stepped away for a moment. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought they were simply decorative elements in the carved stonework around the window. Perhaps stylized representations of watchful guardians or some kind of architectural flourish meant to give the toll plaza a distinctive character. But as I stared at them more closely, leaning forward in my driver's seat to get a better view, I realized that they weren't carved at all but were actual eyes. Dozens of them embedded in the stone itself and blinking with slow, deliberate movements that made my skin crawl with an instinctive revulsion. The eyes were all different colors and sizes, some human-looking, others distinctly animal, and a few that didn't seem to belong to any earthly creature I could identify. They moved independently of each other, some tracking my movements as I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, others gazing off into the fog with an alien intelligence that suggested they were seeing things far beyond the physical world around them. The largest eye, positioned directly above the toll window, was a pale blue color that seemed to glow with its own internal light, and it fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to put my truck in gear and drive away as fast as possible. A soft tapping sound drew my attention back to the window, where a figure had finally appeared. Though calling it human would have been generous, the toll collector was impossibly tall and thin, with skin like worn parchment and fingers that were far too long for any normal hand. And when it smiled at me through the glass, I could see that its teeth were arranged in rows like a shark's, gleaming white points that caught the amber light of the plaza. "Good evening, driver," it said, and its voice carried clearly through the closed window despite being barely above a whisper, each word seeming to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly inside my skull. "Welcome to the watching toll. The fee tonight is one memory of your choosing, preferably something precious that you've held close to your heart for many years." I stared at the creature, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing and hearing, and I found myself reaching for my CB radio with trembling fingers, desperate to make contact with another driver, anyone who might be able to confirm that I wasn't losing my sanity on this fog-shrouded stretch of highway. But the radio produced only static, a harsh white noise that seemed to grow louder the more frantically I adjusted the dials, and the eyes in the stonework began to blink more rapidly, as if they were excited by my growing panic. "There's no need to call for help," the toll collector continued, its head tilting at an angle that would have broken any normal person's neck. "The watching toll appears only to those who travel alone in the deep hours of the night, and it serves a very specific purpose in the cosmic order of things. The eyes you see around you belong to travelers who couldn't pay the toll, and they've been watching the highway ever since, learning the secrets that only the darkness can teach." I tried to speak, to ask what kind of twisted joke this was supposed to be, but my voice caught in my throat like sawdust, and all I could manage was a strangled whisper that barely qualified as sound. The fog around the toll plaza had grown thicker while we'd been talking, and I could no longer see the highway behind me in my mirrors, as if the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist beyond this small circle of amber light and watching eyes. The creature extended one of its impossibly long hands toward my window, and I could see that its palm was covered with the same kind of eyes that decorated the stonework, each one blinking independently and tracking my movements with predatory interest. "Choose carefully," it said, and now its voice carried undertones of impatience that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "A first kiss, perhaps, or the memory of your mother's voice, or the way your daughter looked when she took her first steps. Something meaningful, something that defines who you are." Panic finally broke through the paralysis that had gripped me, and I slammed my truck into gear, the transmission groaning in protest as I stomped on the accelerator and felt the big Kenworth lurch forward. The toll collector's laughter followed me as I crashed through what should have been a wooden barrier arm, but felt more like breaking through a spider's web, sticky and clinging and somehow alive. My truck's headlights swept across the highway ahead as I gained speed, and I could see normal interstate stretching into the distance, the familiar white lines and green signs that told me I was back in the real world, or at least what I hoped was the real world. But in my side mirrors, I could still see the amber glow of the toll plaza fading into the fog, and for just a moment before it disappeared completely, I could swear I saw hundreds of eyes blinking in the darkness, watching me escape. I drove for another 3 hours before I felt safe enough to stop at a truck stop near the California border. And when I tried to tell the other drivers about what had happened, they just shook their heads and suggested I get more sleep between runs. But I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm driving alone through the fog on dark highways, I catch glimpses of amber lights in my peripheral vision and feel the weight of invisible eyes tracking my movement through the night, the gnawing hours. From Jake, the diesel engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar lullaby as I rolled through the Nevada desert, the darkness beyond my headlights stretching endless and empty. I'd been hauling freight across this route for 15 years, knew every truck stop, every pothole, every mile marker between Reno and Las Vegas like they were old friends. The radio crackled with static and distant voices of other drivers, their conversations fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. It was just past 2 in the morning, that dead hour when the world seems to hold its breath and wait for dawn. My hands gripped the steering wheel, leather worn and familiar, as I navigated the gentle curves of Highway 95. The cab was my sanctuary, decorated with photos of my daughter's graduation, a small cross hanging from the rearview mirror, and the usual collection of receipts and paperwork that accumulates in a trucker's life. Everything had its place. Everything was exactly as it should be, which is why the sound caught my attention so completely. It started as a soft scratching, barely audible above the engine's steady rumble. At first I thought it might be static from the CB radio, or perhaps a loose piece of trim rattling somewhere in the cab, but as the miles rolled beneath my tires, the sound persisted, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from the dashboard area, specifically from the direction of the glove compartment. I reached over during a straight stretch of highway and gave the compartment door a gentle tap, thinking something inside might have come loose. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the noise had suddenly become aware of my attention. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself, pregnant with an expectation I couldn't quite name. 20 minutes later, as I passed a lonely billboard advertising a casino still 200 miles away, the scratching resumed. This time it was more pronounced, more deliberate, as if something inside the glove compartment was working very hard to get out. I pulled over at the next rest area, a desolate patch of asphalt with a single flickering streetlight that cast more shadows than illumination. The desert wind whistled around the cab as I turned off the engine, and in the sudden quiet I could hear the scratching more clearly. It wasn't random or chaotic, but methodical, almost purposeful. With a mixture of curiosity and growing unease, I reached for the glove compartment latch. The plastic handle felt oddly warm under my fingers, as if something on the other side had been pressing against it. When I opened the compartment, my flashlight beam revealed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The inside walls, which had been smooth black plastic when I'd last opened it to retrieve my registration 2 weeks ago, were now covered with deep gouges, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scored into the plastic in overlapping patterns that resembled nothing so much as teeth marks. Some were small and sharp, others larger and more jagged, but all of them looked fresh, the plastic still showing pale scratches where something had gnawed and clawed with desperate persistence. My insurance papers, registration and owner's manual were shredded beyond recognition, reduced to confetti-like strips that bore the same distinctive marks. Even my spare sunglasses had been mangled, the frames twisted and bearing deep impressions that looked disturbingly like bite marks. But what disturbed me most was that everything was still contained within the compartment, as if whatever had caused this destruction had been trapped inside. I slammed the compartment shut and sat back in my seat, heart hammering against my ribs. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe mice had somehow gotten into the cab, though I'd never seen or heard any evidence of rodents. Maybe the plastic had degraded somehow, though the truck was only 3 years old and I kept it meticulously maintained. But even as I grasped for rational answers, a deeper part of me knew that what I'd seen defied easy explanation. The scratching began again, more frantic now, as if my discovery had somehow agitated whatever was responsible. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, hoping that motion and distance might somehow solve the problem. But as the miles passed, the sounds from the glove compartment grew more violent, more desperate. It sounded like something was throwing itself against the inside walls with increasing fury. By the time I reached the outskirts of Las Vegas, the noise had become so loud that I could hear it clearly over the engine, the radio, and the rumble of the road. Other drivers on the CB were starting to comment on strange sounds coming from different trucks, their voices tight with confusion and fear. One driver, a veteran named Red who'd been hauling for 30 years, reported that his entire dashboard seemed to be moving, bulging outward as if something was pushing from within. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop just off the strip, parking under the harsh fluorescent lights that turned everything pale and unreal. A dozen other trucks were already there, their drivers gathered in small groups talking in hushed voices about the strange phenomena affecting their rigs. Some had marks on their steering wheels, deep impressions that looked like they'd been made by powerful jaws. Others reported damage to their seats, their door panels, even their gear shifters. As we compared our experiences, a pattern began to emerge. All of us had been driving the same route. All of us had picked up loads from the same distribution center in Reno 3 days ago. But more disturbing was the timing. The manifestations had all begun at the same time, just after 2 a.m., as if something had awakened simultaneously in all our trucks. I approached my Peterbilt with growing dread, the other drivers watching from a cautious distance. The scratching from the glove compartment had reached a fever pitch, and now I could see that the entire dashboard was vibrating with the force of whatever was trapped inside. The compartment door was bulging outward, the plastic creaking and straining as if under enormous pressure. With trembling fingers, I reached for the latch. The moment I touched it, the scratching stopped. The silence was absolute, more frightening than the noise had been. Slowly, very slowly, I opened the compartment door. What spilled out defied every law of physics and reality I thought I understood. Dozens of small, pale objects tumbled onto the passenger seat and floor, each one roughly the size and shape of a human tooth. But these weren't normal teeth. They moved with purposeful intent, skittering across the upholstery like living things, leaving tiny scratches and gouges in their wake. As I watched in horrified fascination, more teeth poured from the compartment, far more than should have been able to fit in such a small space. They seemed to multiply as they emerged, spreading throughout the cab with a sound like chattering wind chimes. Some began working on the door panels, gnawing with methodical precision. Others attacked the steering wheel, the gear shift, the radio knobs, anything they could sink their impossible sharpness into. I stumbled backward out of the cab, shouting for the other drivers to stay away. But it was too late. Similar scenes were playing out at trucks throughout the lot. Drivers were abandoning their rigs as swarms of animated teeth poured from glove compartments, ashtrays, and storage bins, spreading like a plague of calcium and enamel across the parking lot. The teeth moved with collective intelligence, flowing around obstacles and reforming their groups with unsettling coordination. They seemed drawn to anything organic, clustering around the terrified driver's boots and pants cuffs before the men could retreat to the safety of the truck stop building. Through the windows, we watched as our trucks were systematically dismantled from the inside out, the teeth working with patient, inexorable hunger. Emergency services arrived within an hour, but there was little they could do except cordon off the area and begin asking questions no one could answer. By dawn, the teeth had vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared, leaving behind trucks that were hollow shells, their interiors gnawed down to metal framework and bare springs. The investigation that followed turned up nothing useful. The distribution center in Reno showed no signs of tampering or contamination. The loads we'd carried were ordinary consumer goods, nothing that could explain the nightmare we'd experienced. Officials eventually classified it as mass hysteria, combined with coordinated vandalism, though they could never explain the distinctive bite marks or how so much damage had been done so quickly. I never drove professionally again after that night. Couldn't bring myself to climb into another truck cab, knowing that somewhere in some hidden compartment something might be waiting, scratching, gnawing, growing stronger with each passing mile. Sometimes late at night I still hear that sound, that patient, methodical scratching that speaks of hunger that can never be satisfied, and teeth that will never stop growing. The other drivers scattered to different routes, different lives, but we stay in touch through an informal network of phone calls and emails. Every few months, one of us reports hearing the scratching again, finding new teeth marks in unexpected places, or discovering small pale objects that shouldn't exist but somehow do. The cargo that whispers back, from Jake Hensley. The dispatch came through at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, crackling over the CB with that familiar static that always made me think of distant storms. I was nursing a lukewarm coffee at the Flying J outside Bakersfield when Dolores from headquarters gave me the details. Special freight pickup from a warehouse district in Fresno. Destination somewhere up in the Oregon timber country. The manifest was light on specifics, just listing the cargo as agricultural specimens and research materials. The pay was good enough to make me forget about asking too many questions. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar lullaby as I rolled through the empty streets toward the pickup location, her 18 wheels finding their rhythm on the worn asphalt. The warehouse district felt abandoned at this hour, streetlights casting sickly yellow pools between stretches of darkness, where shadows seemed to gather and whisper among themselves. Most of the buildings stood dark and hollow, their loading docks sealed tight like closed eyes. The address led me to a converted facility that might have housed automotive parts or machinery during daylight hours, but now breathed with the quiet patience of a place that preferred the cover of night. Two men in coveralls waited by the loading dock, their faces pale under the fluorescent work lights. They moved with the careful precision of people handling something fragile or dangerous, guiding a series of wooden crates onto my flatbed trailer with a hydraulic lift. The crates were larger than I had expected, each one roughly the size of a small refrigerator, constructed from dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Metal bands reinforced each corner, and I noticed small ventilation holes drilled in precise patterns along the sides. The older of the two workers, a thin man with nervous eyes, handed me the paperwork with fingers that trembled slightly in the cold night air. "Keep the trailer temperature steady," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The specimens are sensitive to fluctuations, and whatever you do, don't open the crates. The climate seal is crucial for transport." His partner nodded agreement, both men stepping back from the trailer as if they were eager to put distance between themselves and whatever they had just loaded. I secured the cargo with practiced efficiency, checking the tie-down straps twice before pulling away from the dock. The weight distribution felt normal, maybe 8,000 pounds total across 6 crates, well within my rig's capacity. But as I accelerated onto Highway 99 northbound, I noticed something odd about the load's behavior. Most cargo settles into a steady rhythm once you reach cruising speed, becoming part of the truck's natural motion. These crates seemed to shift subtly, creating tiny variations in the trailer's balance that required constant minor adjustments to the steering wheel. The first few hours passed uneventfully as I made my way through the Central Valley, the highway stretching ahead like a ribbon of black silk under the star-scattered sky. My CB radio picked up occasional chatter from other drivers, voices drifting in and out of range like ships passing in an electronic fog. The diesel engine maintained its steady rumble, that 18-liter Caterpillar singing the song that had carried me across millions of miles over the past 15 years. Everything felt routine except for that persistent sense that the cargo was somehow restless, never quite settling into the passive stillness that freight usually maintained during transport. Around 3 a.m, as I climbed into the foothills approaching Redding, I began to hear sounds from the trailer that couldn't be explained by normal road vibration or thermal expansion, soft scratching noises like fingernails dragging across wood from the inside. At first I attributed the sounds to my imagination, the product of fatigue and too much coffee. But they persisted even when I rolled down the windows to let fresh mountain air clear my head. The scratching was joined by other noises, subtle tapping sounds that seemed to follow no particular rhythm, and occasionally something that reminded me of whispered conversations held just below the threshold of understanding. I pulled into a truck stop near Mount Shasta to check the load and grab a few hours of mandated rest. The parking area was nearly empty, just a handful of other rigs scattered across the asphalt like sleeping giants. I walked back to inspect my trailer with a flashlight, checking each crate carefully for signs of damage or shifting. Everything appeared secure, the wooden container showing no obvious stress or movement, but as I stood there in the circle of yellow light cast by the overhead sodium lamps, I could swear I heard movement from within the crates themselves. The sounds were clearer now, definitely coming from inside the cargo. Not the random settling of packed materials, but purposeful movement that suggested something alive and aware was contained within those dark wooden boxes. I remembered the loader's instructions about maintaining climate control and not opening the crates, and decided that whatever was making those sounds was supposed to be there. Agricultural specimens, the manifest had said. Perhaps some kind of exotic livestock or research animals being transported to a university or laboratory facility. I climbed into the sleeper berth for what I intended to be a 4-hour rest. But sleep proved elusive. The sounds from the trailer continued, sometimes fading to near silence, then returning with renewed intensity. The scratching became more persistent, joined by what sounded like gentle knocking from multiple locations within each crate. I found myself lying awake, listening to the strange symphony emanating from my cargo, wondering what kind of specimens required such careful handling and secretive transport. Around dawn, I gave up on sleep and resumed the journey northward. The morning light revealed the magnificent landscape of Northern California, giving way to the dense forests of Southern Oregon, towering Douglas firs and redwoods creating cathedral walls along the highway. The sounds from the trailer had quieted somewhat with the coming of daylight, settling into occasional movements that I was beginning to recognize as patterns. The scratching would start in one crate, then spread to the others as if some kind of communication was taking place between the contents of each container. The delivery address led me deep into timber country, following increasingly narrow roads until I reached a research facility, tucked away among the ancient trees. The buildings were modern but designed to blend with the natural environment, their cedar siding and green metal roofs making them nearly invisible from a distance. A woman in a lab coat met me at the delivery gate, her expression serious as she reviewed my paperwork and directed me to a specialized loading dock, equipped with climate-controlled handling equipment. The facility's workers began unloading the crates, with the same careful precision I had witnessed during pickup. I asked the woman about the nature of the specimens I had been carrying. She studied me for a long moment before responding, as if deciding how much information was safe to share. Rare arthropods, she said finally, extremely sensitive to environmental changes and disturbance. Some species that were thought to be extinct until recently discovered populations were located in remote cave systems. I watched as they wheeled the first crate toward the facility entrance, noting how the workers maintained significant distance from the containers, even while handling them with professional efficiency. Just before the crate disappeared through the doorway, I heard that familiar scratching sound, louder now and more insistent, accompanied by a series of tapping noises that sounded almost like Morse code. The woman noticed my reaction and offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They're quite active during transport," she explained, signing my delivery receipt with quick, nervous strokes. "The vibration and movement seem to stimulate their natural behaviors. Thank you for maintaining the proper handling protocols during the journey." She handed me an envelope containing my payment and a substantial cash bonus, then stood watching as I prepared to leave. remaining motionless by the loading dock until my truck disappeared around the first curve in the forest road. The return trip felt strangely empty, without the constant subtle movements and mysterious sounds that had accompanied me northward. My trailer rode smoothly now, responding to steering inputs with mechanical predictability instead of the organic restlessness that had characterized the loaded journey. But as I merged onto Interstate 5 heading south, I found myself missing that sense of carrying something alive and aware. Creatures that had somehow made their presence known despite being sealed away in their dark wooden containers. Even now, weeks later and hundreds of loads down the road, I sometimes catch myself listening for those scratching sounds during quiet moments in the cab. I wonder what kind of arthropods require such secretive handling, and why specimens supposedly extinct until recently needed to be transported under cover of darkness to a hidden research facility in the deep woods. Most of all, I wonder if those tapping sounds really were just random movements, or if something in those crates was trying to communicate, sending messages that I was never meant to understand but will never quite be able to forget. The Silverware Diner. From Marcus, the chrome of my Peterbilt caught the last amber rays of sunset as I pulled into the gravel lot of Mel's Roadside Diner, somewhere deep in the Nevada desert where the highway stretched endlessly in both directions, like a black ribbon across eternity. The neon sign buzzed and flickered overhead, casting an unsteady pink glow across the weathered building that looked like it had been serving truckers and travelers since the Eisenhower administration. My stomach rumbled with the hollow ache that comes from driving 12 hours straight, on nothing but gas station coffee and determination, and the promise of a hot meal drew me forward like a beacon in the growing darkness. The diesel engine settled into silence with its familiar mechanical sigh, and I climbed down from the cab into air that still held the day's heat despite the sun's retreat behind distant mountains. Through the diner's large windows, I could see the warm yellow light spilling out onto the asphalt, and the silhouettes of other late-night diners hunched over their meals at red vinyl booths. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and the familiar sounds of sizzling grease and clinking dishes greeted me along with the rich aroma of coffee that had been brewing, too long, and hamburgers on the grill. The waitress who approached me moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working the night shift for years, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and her uniform crisp despite the late hour. Her name tag read Betty in faded letters, and her smile held the kind of weary kindness that comes from serving countless travelers who pass through once and never return. She led me to a booth near the window where I could keep an eye on my rig, and I slid onto the cracked vinyl seat that had been worn smooth by thousands of meals served to people just passing through. The menu was exactly what I expected from a place like this. Laminated pages featuring photographs of generous portions that looked like they had been taken sometime in the 1970s, but somehow made everything look even more appealing. I ordered the meatloaf special with mashed potatoes and green beans, comfort food that would sit well during the remaining hours of driving that stretched ahead of me. Betty poured coffee into a heavy ceramic mug that felt reassuring in my hands, and I settled back to watch the other diners while I waited for my meal to arrive. There was something oddly peaceful about the scene, the way everyone seemed content to eat in relative silence while the ancient jukebox played soft country songs that drifted through the air like gentle background music. An elderly couple shared a piece of apple pie at the counter, taking turns feeding each other small bites with obvious affection. A lone trucker at the far end of the restaurant methodically worked his way through what looked like a mountain of pancakes, occasionally glancing up to nod at me in the universal acknowledgement that passes between drivers on the road. When Betty returned with my plate, the food looked exactly as advertised. Generous portions of home-style cooking that steamed invitingly in the diner's warm light. She set down the standard complement of silverware wrapped in a paper napkin, and I unrolled it eagerly, my appetite sharpened by the long day and the promise of the first real meal I had eaten since breakfast 12 hours earlier. The meatloaf was thick and perfectly browned. The mashed potatoes formed a generous mountain beside it, and the green beans looked like they had been seasoned with just the right amount of butter and pepper. I picked up the fork and cut off a substantial bite of meatloaf, anticipating the satisfying taste of a well-prepared meal. But when I lifted the fork toward my mouth, the piece of meat simply slid off the tines and fell back onto the plate with a soft thud. I frowned and tried again, this time being more careful to secure the bite properly. But once again the food refused to stay on the fork, sliding off as if the metal tines were coated with some invisible substance that repelled everything I tried to pick up. Examining the fork more closely, I could see that it appeared perfectly normal. 4 straight tines extending from a handle that looked like standard diner silverware, worn smooth by countless washings but showing no obvious defects or damage. I tried to spear a green bean, thinking perhaps the meatloaf was simply too soft to hold together properly. But the vegetable seemed to slip around the fork as if the tines were passing right through it, without making contact. Even when I pressed down firmly, the fork would not grip or hold anything on my plate. I looked around the diner to see if anyone else was experiencing similar difficulties, but the other diners continued eating normally, their forks working exactly as expected as they consumed their meals with obvious satisfaction. The elderly couple at the counter successfully shared their pie, taking neat bites without any apparent struggle. The trucker with the pancakes cut and lifted each bite with mechanical precision, his fork functioning perfectly as he methodically cleared his plate. Betty noticed my confusion and approached the table with the kind of concerned expression that suggested she genuinely cared about her customers' dining experience. When I explained that my fork seemed to be malfunctioning somehow, she looked puzzled for a moment before disappearing into the kitchen and returning with a replacement from a different set. This fork looked identical to the first, standard diner silverware that should have worked without any issue. But when I attempted to use it, the same impossible phenomenon occurred. Food simply would not stay on the tines, sliding off or passing through as if the fork existed in some different realm, where the normal laws of physics did not apply. Now thoroughly perplexed, I asked Betty if she had ever encountered anything like this before, but she shook her head with genuine bewilderment and offered to bring me a third fork from yet another set. As she walked away, I noticed that her own movements seemed somehow different, as if she were walking through air that was slightly thicker than normal, and the sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor seemed to echo in a way that did not quite match the diner's acoustics. The third fork proved equally useless, and I began to feel a creeping sense of unease that went beyond simple frustration with defective silverware. I tried using the knife to cut my food into smaller pieces that I could eat with my hands, but the blade seemed to pass through the meatloaf without actually cutting it, leaving the surface unmarked despite my efforts. The spoon was no better, unable to hold even the softest mashed potatoes, which seemed to flow through the bowl of the spoon like water through a sieve. Other diners continued their meals around me, their silverware functioning normally while mine remained completely useless. And I began to notice other subtle inconsistencies that had escaped my attention before. The elderly couple's pie never seemed to get smaller despite their continued eating, each bite they took somehow failing to diminish the slice on their plate. The trucker's stack of pancakes remained the same height, even as he methodically worked his way through what should have been multiple servings. The ambient sounds of the diner began to take on a strange quality, as if they were being played back through speakers that were not quite properly calibrated. The sizzling from the kitchen just slightly out of sync with the movements I could see through the pass-through window. Even my own coffee had begun to taste different, not unpleasant, but somehow not quite right, as if it were missing some essential quality that would make it recognizably coffee, rather than simply a hot brown liquid that resembled the familiar beverage. Betty returned to check on me again, and I could see genuine concern in her eyes as she asked if everything was all right. But her voice seemed to reach my ears from a greater distance than the few feet that separated us, and her movements had taken on an increasingly dreamlike quality that made me wonder if I was more tired than I had realized. I explained that none of the silverware would work for me, that I could not seem to eat anything on my plate despite being genuinely hungry, and she offered to have the cook prepare something different, perhaps something that would not require utensils. As she walked back toward the kitchen, I noticed that her reflection in the window did not quite match her actual movement, lagging behind by just a fraction of a second, and the neon light from outside seemed to be flickering in a pattern that was almost but not quite regular, like a code being transmitted in a language I could not understand. The other diners had begun to look less real somehow, their movements becoming repetitive and mechanical, as if they were going through the motions of eating, without actually consuming anything. The realization hit me with the force of sudden understanding that what I was experiencing was not a problem with the silverware, but something far more fundamental and disturbing. This place, this diner that had seemed so welcoming and normal, was somehow not entirely real, existing in a state where the basic functions of the physical world operated according to different rules that applied only to newcomers like myself. I was trapped in a location where I could not eat, could not nourish myself, could only sit and slowly weaken while surrounded by the illusion of abundance. The voice that calls from empty roads, from Marcus Del Rey. The first time I heard my dead brother's voice coming from another truck's horn, I was 300 miles into a night run through the Dakotas, where the darkness stretches so wide it feels like driving through the belly of some sleeping giant. The highway was mine alone, just me and the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine, the kind of solitude that truckers either love or learn to fear. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, ever since Tommy died in that rollover outside Flagstaff, and I thought I knew every sound the road could make. The CB had been quiet for hours, nothing but the occasional crackle of distant conversations that faded in and out like radio ghosts. Rain began to speckle my windshield around midnight, not enough to slow me down, but sufficient to turn the world beyond my headlights into a blur of motion and shadow. That's when I first saw the other truck, a dark shape in my mirrors that seemed to appear without warning, as if it had materialized from the storm itself. At first, I paid it no mind. Trucks pass each other all night long on these endless stretches of interstate, ships in the darkness acknowledging each other with brief flashes of running lights before disappearing back into their separate journeys. But this one stayed back there, matching my speed precisely, never gaining or falling behind, just maintaining that steady distance like it was tethered to my trailer by invisible chains. The rain was picking up now, drumming against my cab with increasing intensity, and the wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, clearing arcs of visibility that revealed nothing but more darkness ahead. I tried to get a better look at the following truck through my mirrors, but the rain and the glare of its headlights made it impossible to distinguish any details. It could have been any make or model, any color, driven by any of the thousands of drivers who haunt these highways night after night. Something about its persistence nagged at me, though. The way it held that exact position no matter how I varied my speed, speeding up when I did, slowing down when I eased off the throttle, like it was reading my intentions before I fully formed them myself. The first honk came at 12:47 a.m., according to my dashboard clock, a single sharp blast that cut through the rain and the engine noise with startling clarity. But it wasn't the horn that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. It was what I heard mixed in with that mechanical sound, a voice faint but unmistakable calling my name. Not shouting it, but speaking it in that familiar way Tommy used to when he wanted my attention. That slightly nasal tone that our mother always said made him sound younger than his years. I shook my head, convinced that the long hours and the monotonous rhythm of the road were playing tricks on my perception. Truckers talk about highway hypnosis, that state where your mind starts to drift and create patterns where none exist. And I figured that's all this was. The rain was getting heavier, forcing me to slow down as visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet beyond my headlights. The truck behind me slowed too, maintaining that same eerie distance, its lights boring into my mirrors like accusatory eyes. 20 minutes later, the horn sounded again, longer this time, and there was no mistaking what I heard woven through that mechanical wail. Marcus, it called, clear as if Tommy was sitting in the passenger seat beside me. "Marcus, slow down." The same words he'd spoken to me on our last run together, when I'd been pushing too hard through a snowstorm in Colorado, trying to make up time after a delayed pickup. He'd been right then, had probably saved both our lives with that warning, and hearing those exact words now sent a chill crawling up my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I grabbed my CB radio, hands trembling slightly as I keyed the microphone. "Breaker 19, this is northbound Peterbilt at mile marker 247. Anybody got ears on?" Static filled the cab, punctuated by the steady percussion of rain on metal. Got a truck following me, wondering if the driver wants to come up on the radio. Nothing but electronic whispers and the distant, garbled fragments of conversations from hundreds of miles away. The following truck's headlights suddenly flared brighter, and for a moment I thought it was going to close the gap between us. But instead it began flashing them in a pattern I recognized. Short, short, long, short, short, long. The same Morse code signal Tommy and I had used as kids, playing truckers with our toy rigs in the dirt behind our grandfather's garage. Our secret language that nobody else knew, a connection between brothers that had survived even after I'd started driving real trucks and he'd followed me into the life. My mouth went dry as I watched those lights pulse in my mirrors, spelling out the same message over and over. Come back. That's what it meant, our childhood code for turn around and come home. But Tommy couldn't be signaling me, because Tommy had been dead for 3 years, killed when his rig jackknifed on a patch of black ice and rolled 6 times before coming to rest in a ravine that took the rescue crews 8 hours to reach. I'd identified what was left of him, had spoken at his funeral, had carried a corner of his casket to the grave where he still lay. The horn came again, and this time Tommy's voice was stronger, more insistent. "Marcus, you need to turn around. There's something wrong up ahead. The bridge is out." I knew he was talking about the Clearwater Creek Bridge, still 15 miles up the highway, a span I'd crossed hundreds of times without incident. But as I listened to his voice, carried impossibly through the horn of a truck driven by someone who couldn't possibly know our history, I felt a certainty settling in my chest like a cold stone. I eased off the accelerator, letting my speed drop from 70 to 60 to 50, and the truck behind me matched my deceleration perfectly. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see nothing but the white lines disappearing under my hood, and the occasional reflector post blinking past like dying stars. The CB remained silent despite my repeated attempts to raise the other driver, and my cell phone showed no signal bars, leaving me isolated in my moving metal capsule with only the sound of the storm and the persistent rumble of the engine following behind me. When the horn sounded for the 4th time, Tommy's voice was urgent, almost desperate. "Please, Marcus, I can't lose you too." How like this? The words hit me like a physical blow, because they were something he might have said. Something that sounded like the brother who had always worried about me, who had followed me into trucking because he didn't want me to be alone on the road, who had died trying to make one last delivery before coming home for Christmas. I pulled over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, and watched in my mirrors as the other truck rolled past. For just a moment as it drew alongside my cab, I caught a glimpse of the driver through the rain-distorted side window. It was too dark, and the conditions too poor to make out features. But something about the silhouette, the way the shoulders sat, the angle of the head, made my breath catch in my throat. Then it was past me, disappearing into the storm ahead, its taillights quickly swallowed by the darkness and the driving rain. I sat there for 10 minutes, heart hammering, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Fatigue, stress, the anniversary of Tommy's death approaching in 2 weeks. All of it could have combined to create an elaborate hallucination. The mind was capable of incredible self-deception, especially under the monotonous conditions of long-haul driving. I almost convinced myself to continue north, to dismiss the whole episode as nothing more than an overworked imagination and too much coffee. Instead, I turned around. The detour added 4 hours to my delivery schedule, but when I finally reached a truck stop with Wi-Fi and checked the local news, I found the story buried in a small-town website's breaking news section. The Clearwater Creek Bridge had suffered a catastrophic support failure at 1:23 a.m., the same time I would have been crossing it if I'd maintained my original speed and route. A combination of heavy rain, flooding, and a structural weakness that inspectors hadn't caught during the last safety review had brought down the entire center span. There were no casualties, the article noted, because state police had managed to close the bridge just minutes before the collapse, alerted by reports from a truck driver who had called 911 claiming to see dangerous structural damage in his headlights. I never found out who that driver was, never learned what happened to the truck with the impossible horn, but sometimes on long nights when the highway stretches empty before me and the darkness presses close against my windshield, I hear that familiar sound in the distance, Tommy's voice, carried on the wind and the rumble of 18 wheels still watching over his older brother, still trying to bring me safely home, the route that remembers. From Marcus Chen, the GPS unit had been a gift from my daughter Sarah when I started long-haul trucking 3 years ago. She'd saved up from her part-time job at the grocery store to buy me what she called the fancy one with the British lady voice, reasoning that anything with that accent had to be trustworthy. For 36 months, that calm, proper voice had guided me through countless miles of interstate highways, backwoods shortcuts, and late-night delivery runs across the continental United States. The device had become as familiar to me as the rumble of my Peterbilt's diesel engine or the gentle sway of the cab when crosswinds hit the trailer. Tonight found me somewhere in the endless stretch of Nebraska farmland, hauling a load of industrial machinery bound for Denver. The October rain had been falling steadily for the past 2 hours, creating a rhythmic percussion against the windshield that competed with the steady thrum of the engine. My wipers swept back and forth in their eternal dance, clearing the glass just long enough for me to catch glimpses of cornfields stretching into darkness on both sides of the 2-lane highway. The radio had lost its signal about 50 miles back, leaving me with only the ambient sounds of the road and the occasional crackle of the CB when another driver passed by in the opposite direction. I'd been driving this particular route for over a year now, making the run from Chicago to Denver twice monthly for Hartwell Manufacturing. The GPS knew this journey as well as I did, rarely needing to recalculate or offer guidance beyond the occasional reminder of upcoming turns or rest stops. Tonight, however, something felt different about the familiar blue glow of the screen mounted on my dashboard. The device seemed more active than usual, the screen flickering with updates and route calculations despite the fact that I was traveling straight down Highway 30 with no turns for another 100 miles. As I crested a small hill, the GPS suddenly announced in its characteristic British accent, "In half a mile, turn right onto County Road 47. The instruction came so unexpectedly that I actually glanced down at the screen, expecting to see some error message or indication of signal interference. Instead, the display showed a clear route deviation, a thin blue line branching off from the main highway and winding through what appeared to be rural farmland before eventually rejoining the interstate about 20 miles to the south. I frowned, knowing from experience that there was no County Road 47 along this stretch of highway. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and the next legitimate turnoff wasn't for another 40 miles. Recalculating, I said aloud to no one, reaching toward the GPS to input my destination again. But before my fingers reached the screen, the device spoke again. And this time there was something different about the voice. Something that made me pull my hand back as if the unit had suddenly become hot to the touch. Turn right in quarter mile, the GPS repeated, but now the crisp British accent carried an undertone that I'd never heard before. It was subtle at first, just a slight inflection that seemed almost amused, as if the device was enjoying some private joke. As the words faded, I could swear I heard the faintest echo of what sounded like laughter, a soft chuckling that seemed to emanate from the speaker, before dissolving into the steady hum of road noise. The headlights of my truck suddenly illuminated a road sign that I'd never noticed before. County Road 47, 500 feet. The green metal rectangle looked authentic enough, properly reflective and mounted on standard highway posts. But something about its appearance troubled me in a way I couldn't articulate. Perhaps it was too clean, too unmarked by the weather and wear that characterized every other sign along this rural stretch of Nebraska highway. Or maybe it was the way the reflective surface seemed to hold my truck's light just a fraction of a second longer than physics should have allowed. "Turn right now," the GPS instructed as I approached the intersection, and this time the laughter was unmistakable. It started as a low chuckle that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep within the device's electronic circuitry, gradually growing in volume and intensity until it filled the cab of my truck with a sound that was equal parts amused and malevolent. The laugh had a distinctly feminine quality, but it was no longer the refined British accent I'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it carried the harsh edge of someone who had discovered a particularly cruel joke and was savoring the anticipation of its punchline. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I passed the turnoff, choosing to ignore the GPS's directive and continue straight on the familiar highway. The rain continued to fall, but now each droplet seemed to strike the windshield with deliberate intent, creating patterns on the glass that resembled faces in profile, their mouths open in silent screams or twisted into expressions of dark amusement. I reached for the CB radio, thinking I might contact another driver and ask if they'd experienced any strange GPS behavior in the area. But the radio produced only static, punctuated by brief bursts of what sounded like the same feminine laughter, now emanating from my navigation device. "Recalculating," the GPS announced, its voice returning to the familiar British accent but retaining that underlying current of barely contained mirth. The screen flickered and updated, showing a new route that looped back toward County Road 47 from a different angle. "In 2 miles, make a U-turn and proceed to the highlighted route for optimal travel time." The word optimal was drawn out slightly, emphasized in a way that suggested multiple meanings, none of them particularly reassuring. I glanced at my fuel gauge and realized with growing unease that I was running lower than expected. The needle hovered just above the quarter tank mark, which should have been sufficient to reach the next truck stop. But according to my calculations, I should have had at least half a tank remaining. It was as if the truck had been consuming fuel at an accelerated rate, though the engine continued to run smoothly and all other instruments read normal. The GPS screen now displayed a helpful indicator, showing a fuel station located just off County Road 47, its symbol pulsing invitingly in bright yellow against the blue background of the map. As I crested another low hill, my headlights swept across a scene that made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. Another truck was pulled over on the shoulder ahead, its hazard lights blinking in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic against the darkness. The vehicle appeared to be an older model Kenworth, its chrome bumper and exhaust stacks gleaming wetly in the precipitation. I could see a figure standing beside the driver's door, waving in my direction with what appeared to be a flashlight. "Assistance available at County Road 47, the GPS announced helpfully, the laughter now woven so seamlessly into the voice that it was difficult to determine where the words ended and the amusement began. "Traffic incident ahead requires alternate route for your safety and convenience." The screen updated to show the stopped truck as a red hazard symbol, with the familiar blue line of the recommended detour pulsing more insistently than before. I activated my CB radio and attempted to contact the stranded driver, but the static had intensified, occasionally resolving into fragments of conversation that seemed to be taking place years in the past. I heard snippets of discussions about weather conditions that didn't match tonight's rain, references to deliveries for companies I'd never heard of, and once distinctly, my own voice reporting my location to a dispatcher I'd worked for briefly in 2019. The temporal displacement of these radio fragments created an unsettling sensation, as if the very air around my truck had become unstuck in time. The GPS laughed again, longer and more freely this time, the sound building to a crescendo that seemed to resonate through the truck's metal frame. "Turn right in 1 mile," it instructed, though I could see no approaching intersection on the rain-soaked highway ahead. "Your destination has been updated for maximum efficiency." The word efficiency was accompanied by a burst of laughter so intense that the device's speaker briefly distorted, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache and sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. As I approached the area where the GPS insisted a turn should be located, my headlights suddenly illuminated another County Road 47 sign, this one appearing exactly where the device had predicted. The sign looked identical to the first one I'd passed, down to the same unnaturally clean appearance and the way it seemed to hold light longer than the surrounding landscape. Behind the sign, a narrow paved road extended into the darkness between 2 fields of corn that rustled with movement, despite the absence of any perceptible wind. The stranded truck I'd seen earlier was now visible in my mirrors, its hazard lights no longer blinking but glowing with a steady amber light that seemed to follow my progress down the highway. When I tried to focus on the vehicle's details in the mirror, they seemed to shift and blur, as if the truck existed in a state of constant flux, never quite maintaining a consistent form long enough for my eyes to process its actual appearance. The Velvet Trap. From Marcus, the thing about being an owner-operator is that you learn to trust your instincts about truck stops, and mine were screaming warnings the moment I pulled into the Desert Rose Travel Plaza outside of Barstow. It was, past 2 in the morning, that dead hour when the highway becomes a ribbon of loneliness stretching between nowhere and nothing, and my Peterbilt's fuel gauge was dancing dangerously close to empty. The neon sign buzzed and flickered in shades of pink and blue, casting strange shadows across the cracked asphalt, and something about the way those colors bled together reminded me of bruised skin. I'd been running this route between Phoenix and Sacramento for the better part of 15 years, and I'd never seen this place before. That should have been my first red flag. You don't just miss a truck stop this size, not with its sprawling lot that could easily accommodate 50 rigs and the kind of modern amenities that would make it a regular stop for every driver working the I-40 corridor. But there it was, as if it had materialized from the desert heat like some chrome and concrete mirage, complete with a diner whose windows glowed warm and inviting against the star-scattered darkness. The fuel pumps hummed their mechanical lullaby. As I topped off my tanks, the digital numbers spinning higher with each gallon, diesel fumes mixed with the sage-scented desert air, creating that familiar cocktail of chemicals and wilderness that defines truck stop nights. I should have climbed back into my cab and rolled on toward Bakersfield, but something about the travel plaza held me. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights seemed softer than usual, or how the constant highway noise faded to a whisper here, as if the place existed in its own pocket of muffled silence. The sleeper berths were arranged in a separate building. Behind the main complex, a long, low structure that resembled a budget motel more than the utilitarian facilities I was accustomed to. Each unit had its own door painted in that same desert rose pink, with small windows that glowed like amber eyes in the darkness. A hand-painted sign by the entrance advertised premium rest solutions and sleep like you're home promises that seemed almost too good to believe for a trucker's overnight accommodation. The clerk inside was a thin woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and when she smiled, her teeth caught the light in a way that made them seem almost translucent. She moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she'd been working nights for decades, anticipating the needs of tired drivers before they even knew what they needed themselves. Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, something that might have been southwestern drawl mixed with something older, more exotic. "You look like you could use some real rest, honey," she said, sliding a key card across the counter, without waiting for me to specify what kind of accommodation I wanted. "Unit 17 is our finest. Climate-controlled, memory foam everything, and soundproof so well you won't hear so much as a cricket chirping outside. It's like sleeping in a cloud." The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously so for amenities that would cost twice as much at any other facility along this route. I should have questioned the deal, but fatigue was settling into my bones like lead, and the thought of spending another night cramped in my cab's sleeper compartment made my back ache in anticipation. Besides, the place seemed clean and professional, despite that nagging sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite define. Unit 17 was everything she'd promised and more. The moment I stepped inside, the desert's dry heat gave way to perfectly conditioned air that smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something deeper and more primal that reminded me of rich soil after rain. The bed dominated the small space, covered in what looked like genuine silk sheets that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. The walls were painted in soothing earth tones, and soft music played from hidden speakers, a wordless melody that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. I should have found it strange that a truck stop would invest in such luxury for transient drivers, should have wondered about the economics of silk sheets and custom sound systems in what was essentially a roadside motel. Instead, I found myself drawn to that magnificent bed like a moth to flame, my road-weary body already anticipating the relief of genuine comfort after weeks of sleeping on a narrow mattress that had seen better years. The sheets were cool against my skin, smooth as water and twice as inviting. The moment my head touched the pillow, I felt a sensation unlike anything I'd experienced in decades of truck stop overnights. It was as if the bed itself was welcoming me, molding itself to every contour of my body, anticipating my needs and adjusting accordingly. The soft music seemed to grow more complex, weaving itself through my consciousness like silk thread through fabric, and I felt my breathing slow to match its hypnotic rhythm. Sleep came quickly, deeper than I'd experienced in years, but it brought dreams that felt more real than waking. I found myself standing in vast corridors that stretched beyond sight, their walls covered in the same rose-colored silk as the sheets. Other figures moved through these spaces, men and women in the practical clothes of long-haul drivers, but their movements were strange, too fluid, as if they were swimming through thick honey rather than walking through air. Their faces held expressions of perfect contentment, but their eyes remained empty, reflecting nothing but that same rose-colored light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I tried to call out to them, but my voice produced no sound, and when I attempted to move closer, I found my own movements had taken on that same liquid quality. The music from the room followed me into this dream space, growing louder and more complex until I realized it wasn't music at all, but voices, hundreds of them, singing in harmonies that hurt something deep inside my chest. The lyrics were in no language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. Welcome, rest, stay, belong, never leave, never want to leave, never need to leave. When I finally struggled back to consciousness, the room's digital clock showed that 18 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. The silk sheets had somehow wrapped themselves around me during the night, not uncomfortably but thoroughly, creating a cocoon that made moving difficult. More disturbing was the realization that I didn't want to move. The bed felt perfect, more comfortable than any sleeping arrangement I'd ever experienced, and the thought of returning to my truck's hard mattress and the endless highway filled me with something approaching dread. I forced myself upright, fighting against the sheet's silken embrace and my own reluctance to leave such comfort behind. The hidden speakers were still playing their wordless melody, and in the artificial twilight of the heavily curtained room, I could swear I saw patterns moving in the wallpaper, subtle shifts in the earth-toned paint that might have been tricks of shadow or something far more intentional. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my dispatcher, increasingly urgent messages about missed delivery windows and concerned customers. I'd never overslept like this in my entire career, never ignored my responsibilities for the sake of comfort, but something about this place made professional concerns seem distant and unimportant. What mattered was the bed, the perfect temperature, the music that seemed to know exactly what my soul needed to hear. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed to gather my belongings and head for the door. The keycard reader beeped softly as I prepared to leave, but something made me pause and look back. The silk sheets had already resettled themselves as if preparing for the next occupant, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw shapes moving beneath their rose-colored surface, pressing up from below like hands seeking contact. The checkout process was seamlessly efficient. The silver-haired clerk smiled that translucent smile and assured me that my stay had been perfectly satisfactory, though I couldn't remember having spoken with her about my experience. She slid another keycard across the counter without being asked, explaining that it was good for a return visit anytime. No reservation necessary, just present it at any Desert Rose location for immediate accommodation in their finest units. I meant to throw the card away the moment I reached my truck, but somehow it ended up in my wallet instead, nestled between my commercial license and my fuel card like it belonged there. The Peterbilt's engine turned over with its familiar rumble, a sound that had always meant freedom and forward motion, but today it seemed harsh and mechanical compared to the silk-smooth silence I'd left behind. 3 weeks have passed since that night, and I've driven past the Desert Rose Travel Plaza 6 times. Each time I tell myself I'm just maintaining my regular route, delivering loads and keeping schedules. But I know I'm lying. The place calls, to me with a voice that sounds like silk sheets rustling and wordless music playing in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat. The keycard rests in my wallet, growing warm against the leather whenever I'm within 50 miles of Barstow. Soon, I know I'll need to sleep somewhere more comfortable than my cab's narrow berth. The convoy of whispers. From Marcus Rivera, the interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale moon. And I'd been driving this route between Denver and Salt Lake for nearly 15 years without anything stranger than a drunk deer stumbling across the asphalt. My Peterbilt hummed its familiar lullaby, the diesel engine's steady rhythm mixing with the soft patter of light rain against the windshield. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing away droplets that caught the amber glow of my running lights. It was just past 2 in the morning, that dead hour when the world belongs to us night haulers and the occasional insomniac in a sedan, and I was making good time with a load of electronics bound for a warehouse outside Provo. That's when I first noticed them in my mirrors. 3 sets of headlights maintaining perfect distance behind me, spaced exactly the same intervals apart. At first I figured it was just coincidence, maybe a small convoy heading the same direction. But as the miles rolled by and we climbed into the mountain passes, those lights never wavered from their formation. They didn't gain ground when the grade flattened out, didn't fall back when we hit the steeper climbs where my load made the engine work harder. They just maintained that eerily precise spacing, like beads on an invisible string. I tried raising them on the CB radio, cycling through channels 19 and 17, even the emergency channel, but got nothing back except static that seemed to pulse in odd rhythms, almost like Morse code if you listened close enough. The static had a quality to it that made my skin crawl, like the sound of fingernails dragging across rough fabric, or wind whistling through a graveyard. I turned the volume down and focused on the road ahead, telling myself it was probably just atmospheric interference from the storm clouds gathering over the peaks. The rain began falling harder as we wound deeper into the mountains, fat drops that exploded against my windshield like tiny water balloons. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the guardrails that separated the asphalt from drops that plunged hundreds of feet into rocky canyons below. This was treacherous country even in daylight, the kind of terrain that had claimed more than its fair share of big rigs over the years, and I felt my shoulders tense as I downshifted for another steep descent. Behind me, those 3 sets of lights maintained their formation with mechanical precision, never varying their distance despite the challenging terrain. I began to make out shadows of the trucks themselves when they crested hills, dark silhouettes that seemed oddly shaped, somehow wrong in proportions I couldn't quite identify. Their headlights had a strange quality too, Not the warm yellow of standard halogens or the crisp white of LEDs, but something in between that reminded me of candlelight flickering behind frosted glass. As we descended into a valley where the rain had turned to thick fog, I caught glimpses of the lead truck in my side mirror during a brief clearing. What I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The cab looked like it might have been a Kenworth once, but the proportions were all wrong, stretched too tall and narrow, with windows that reflected the light in ways that glass shouldn't. The trailer behind it seemed to shimmer and shift in the fog, its outline never quite solid enough to focus on clearly. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the engine respond with a deeper growl, but no matter how much speed I gained on the straightaways, those lights behind me never grew smaller in my mirrors. They matched my pace perfectly, like they were connected to my truck by some invisible tether that kept the distance constant. The fog grew thicker as we wound through the valley, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead of my bumper, and I had to slow to a crawl to navigate the twisting curves safely. That's when I started hearing the whispers over my radio, even though I'd turned the CB off entirely. The voices were faint at first, like conversations bleeding through from distant frequencies, but they grew clearer as the fog closed in around us. Multiple voices, men and women speaking in languages I couldn't identify, but there was something familiar about the cadence, the rhythm of their words that made the hair on my arms stand up. They seemed to be calling names, long lists of names spoken with a desperate urgency that made my chest tight with inexplicable dread. I fumbled for the radio's power switch, double-checking that it was definitely off. But the whispers continued, seeming to come from the speakers and the very air around me. Some of the names being called sounded like they might be American. John and Sarah and Michael mixed in with others in what could have been Spanish or Italian or languages I'd never heard before. The voices had a hollow quality, like people shouting down deep wells or from the bottom of caves, and underneath them all was a sound like wind rushing through empty spaces. The fog began to thin as we climbed out of the valley, and in my mirrors I could see all three trucks clearly for the first time. They were definitely not normal big rigs, their cabs too angular and their trailers seeming to bend light around their edges in ways that hurt to look at directly. The second truck appeared to be missing its front wheels entirely, somehow gliding over the asphalt without touching it, while the third one left no reflection on the wet pavement despite its blazing headlights. I grabbed my cell phone with shaking fingers, hoping to call dispatch or highway patrol, anyone who might be monitoring emergency frequencies, but the screen showed no signal bars at all. The digital clock displayed zeros across all positions, and when I tried to power it off and back on, the screen remained completely black. Even my truck's GPS had gone dark, its screen showing nothing but static that pulsed in the same rhythm as the whispers still emanating from my radio speakers. The convoy behind me began to close distance then, those impossible headlights growing larger in my mirrors as we crested another ridge. I could hear new sounds over the whispers now, the phantom rumble of diesel engines that revved higher than any truck engine should be able to manage, mixed with the screech of air brakes and the groan of metal under stress. But these sounds seemed to come from all directions at once, as if we were surrounded by a much larger convoy of invisible vehicles. I pushed my Peterbilt as hard as I dared on the winding mountain road, the speedometer climbing past safe limits for the conditions, but the three trucks behind me matched my pace effortlessly. In the lead truck's windshield, I thought I could see the outline of a driver, but the figure seemed too tall and too thin, its head cocked at an angle that would be impossible for a human neck. The second truck's cab appeared to be empty entirely, its steering wheel turning by itself to navigate the curves, while shadows moved behind the windshield of the third in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. The whispers over my radio grew louder and more urgent, and I began to recognize what sounded like distress calls, mixed in with the endless recitation of names, mayday signals and requests for help, GPS coordinates and descriptions of accidents, all delivered in that same hollow, echoing tone that seemed to come from somewhere impossibly far away. I realized with growing horror that I might be listening to the final transmissions of drivers who had traveled this route before me, their voices somehow trapped and replaying in an endless loop. As we approached a long straightaway that would take us down toward the interstate junction, I saw my chance and floored it, feeling the truck surge forward with everything the engine could give. The speedometer needle climbed past 80, then 90, faster than I'd ever pushed a loaded rig on a mountain highway. But still, those headlights behind me grew brighter and closer. I could feel their presence now like cold breath on the back of my neck, and the whispers had become a roar of voices that seemed to be calling my name among all the others. Just ahead, I spotted the familiar glow of the truck stop at the junction, its neon signs cutting through the darkness like a beacon of normalcy in this nightmare. I'd stopped there hundreds of times over the years, knew every pump and parking space, and I aimed for it now like it was the finish line of a race for my sanity. My truck screamed down the grade with the convoy of impossible vehicles right on my tail, their headlights now so bright they washed out everything in my mirrors with white fire. I took the off-ramp at dangerous speed, feeling the trailer sway and the tires protest, but somehow managed to keep everything upright as I swung into the truck stop parking lot. I slammed on the brakes and brought the rig to a shuddering stop between two other trucks, real trucks with familiar logos and license plates, then sat there with my hands shaking on the wheel as I waited to see what would follow me off the highway. But the parking lot remained quiet except for the tick of my cooling engine and the whisper of wind through the overhead lights. I climbed down from the cab on unsteady legs and walked back toward the road, but the highway was empty in both directions. The highway mirror that bent heaven. From Marcus Chen, the CB radio crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt down Highway 287 through the Montana darkness, the engine's steady rumble a comforting heartbeat beneath the vast canopy of stars. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across this continent, and the night sky had always been my most faithful companion. Tonight felt different, though, unsettled in a way that made my fingers drum against the worn steering wheel. The load of electronics bound for Seattle shifted slightly in the trailer behind me as I took a gentle curve, the weight familiar and reassuring. The digital clock glowed 2:47 a.m. when I first noticed something peculiar in my driver's side mirror. At first glance, it appeared to be reflecting the usual sight of my trailer's running lights stretching back into the darkness. But there was something wrong with the sky above. Where the mirror should have shown the same constellation of stars visible through my windshield, instead there seemed to be a strange warping, as if the heavens themselves were being pulled and twisted by some invisible force. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand, attributing the oddity to fatigue. 3 days of hard driving from Chicago with only regulation brakes had left me bone-weary, though I prided myself on never letting exhaustion compromise my judgment. The mirror's reflection, however, continued to display that unsettling distortion of the night sky, the stars appearing to spiral slowly around some central point that shouldn't exist in the natural order of things. When I glanced up through my windshield, the real sky remained perfectly normal, a crystalline dome of familiar constellations wheeling in their proper positions. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty of other traffic in this desolate stretch between small Montana towns. My headlights carved a cone of yellow illumination through the crisp autumn air, revealing the endless parade of reflective road markers that had guided countless journeys before mine. The CB remained silent except for the occasional burst of static, and even the usual chatter from other night haulers had died away to nothing. In the strange isolation of this moment, the only sounds were the diesel engine's steady thrum, the whisper of tires on asphalt, and the gentle hiss of air brakes as I navigated the rolling hills. Unable to shake my unease about the mirror's reflection, I began checking it more frequently, each glance revealing the same impossible sight. The stars in the reflected sky continued their slow spiral dance, and gradually I became aware that they weren't simply moving randomly. There was a pattern to their motion, a deliberate choreography that suggested intelligence behind the distortion. The center of the spiral seemed to be growing darker. Not just an absence of stars, but a positive darkness that appeared to have weight and substance. Mile after mile passed beneath my wheels as I wrestled with what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind insisted that mirrors don't lie, that they simply reflect what exists before them according to the immutable laws of physics. Yet the evidence of my own eyes told a different story, one that challenged everything I understood about the nature of reality. The distortion in the reflected sky was becoming more pronounced, the spiral tighter, the dark center more defined. Around 3:20 a.m. I crested a low hill and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the valley below, perhaps 2 miles ahead, sat an old truck stop that I'd never noticed before, despite having driven this route dozens of times over the years. Its neon sign flickered weakly against the darkness, casting a sickly pink glow over a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to huddle together like frightened animals. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the sky above the truck stop perfectly matched what I'd been seeing in my mirror. The stars caught in that same impossible spiral with the growing patch of absolute darkness at its heart. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized I had little choice but to continue forward. The next exit was still 30 miles ahead, and my fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining. The truck stop's diesel pumps gleamed dully under the struggling neon, promising the fuel I needed to reach my destination. Yet every instinct screamed at me to turn around to find another route, to do anything but drive into that valley where the sky itself seemed sick and wrong. As I descended toward the truck stop, I noticed that other vehicles were parked in its lot, their shapes indistinct in the wavering pink light. Big rigs mostly, though I could make out a few cars scattered among them. None showed any signs of life. No lights in their cabs, no movement around the buildings. It was as if they'd simply been abandoned there, left to keep silent vigil under that twisted sky. The closer I got, the more details became visible, and each new revelation added to my growing dread. The neon sign, which I'd initially thought was flickering due to electrical problems, was actually pulsing in rhythm with the spiral motion of the stars overhead. The pink light it cast seemed to have an oily quality, sliding across surfaces rather than illuminating them properly. Even my own truck felt different as we entered that pool of strange radiance, the engine's note changing subtly as if the air itself had become thicker. I pulled up to one of the diesel pumps, my hands trembling slightly as I set the parking brake and prepared to shut down the engine. Through my windshield, the truck stop's main building looked ordinary enough. A typical roadside establishment with large windows revealing the interior, filled with the usual collection of snacks, coffee makers, and trucker supplies. But when I checked my mirror one final time before stepping down from the cab, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart entirely. The reflected sky had changed again. The spiral of stars was now rotating faster, and the dark center had expanded to reveal what could only be described as a hole in reality itself. Through that opening, I glimpsed another sky entirely, one filled with constellations I'd never seen before, patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. Worse still, there were shapes moving in that alien firmament, vast forms that defied description sliding between the foreign stars like leviathans navigating an ocean of space. Fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to focus on the immediate task of refueling. The diesel pump operated normally enough, though the fuel seemed to flow more slowly than usual, giving me more time than I wanted to study my surroundings. The other vehicles in the lot were indeed abandoned, I realized, covered with a fine layer of dust that suggested they'd been sitting there for weeks or perhaps months. Their license plates showed dates from different years, some going back decades, as if this place existed outside the normal flow of time. The truck stop's main door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of the interior that looked frozen in time. I could see a coffee pot still steaming on its burner, newspapers spread on the counter with headlines from various decades, and security monitors showing empty roads under normal skies. But there were no people. No signs of recent human activity, just the persistent hum of refrigeration units and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh, clinical detail. As the fuel pump finally kicked off, I hurried through the payment process, desperate to leave this place behind. But when I climbed back into my cab and prepared to pull away, I discovered that my mirror now showed something even more terrifying. The hole in the reflected sky had grown larger still, and those vast shapes I'd glimpsed earlier were moving with obvious purpose toward our reality. They were coming through, crossing the boundary between their alien realm and our own, drawn perhaps by the beacon of that pulsing neon sign. I gunned the engine and pulled out of the truck stop as quickly as my heavy load would allow, not caring about the rough acceleration or the protest of gears. In my mirrors, I watched the pink glow fade behind me as I climbed back up the hill, but the reflected sky remained distorted, the spiral continuing its hypnotic dance. Only gradually, mile by mile, did the stars begin to return to their proper positions, the hole in space slowly contracting until it finally winked out of existence entirely. By dawn, I was pulling into Seattle right on schedule, my logbook showing nothing unusual about the night's journey except for a fuel stop that, according to the receipt, had occurred at a truck stop that officially closed 15 years ago. The mirror reflects only normal sky now, but sometimes in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of that spiral beginning to form again. And I know that somewhere out there on Highway 287, that place still exists, waiting for the next driver who needs fuel badly enough to ignore the warning signs written in the stars themselves. The fuel that fed the Earth. From Marcus Tank Rodriguez, the thing about being an owner-operator is that every penny counts, especially when diesel's pushing $4.50 a gallon, and your Peterbilt's got a thirsty cat engine that drinks fuel like a sailor on shore leave. That's why when I heard about Eddie's discount fuel off Route 287 in Nebraska, advertising diesel at $3.20 a gallon, I didn't ask too many questions. Should have, though. Should have wondered why a truck stop in the middle of nowhere could undercut everyone else by more than $1. The storm had been following me since Denver, great rolling clouds that turned the afternoon sky the color of old pewter. By the time I spotted Eddie's neon sign flickering through the rain, my fuel gauge was kissing empty and my options were running thin. The truck stop sat by itself in a shallow valley, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to every horizon. The kind of place that looks like it was dropped from the sky and forgotten by time. I pulled up to the diesel island, noting how the concrete was cracked and sprouting weeds, how the overhead canopy sagged slightly to one side. The rain drummed against my windshield in a steady rhythm that nearly drowned out the idle of my engine. Through the cab window I could see the main building, a squat concrete structure with windows so grimy they looked black. The only light came from that dying neon sign and a few flickering fluorescents under the canopy. Eddie himself came out to greet me, a thin man in his 60s with clothes that smelled like motor oil and damp earth. His smile was too wide, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco, but his prices were real enough. $3.20 a gallon, cash only. I handed over the bills and watched him work the old mechanical pumps, the kind I hadn't seen in 20 years of trucking. The fuel that flowed into my tanks looked normal enough. That familiar amber brown of diesel, though it seemed to have an unusual thickness to it, clinging to the nozzle longer than it should. Eddie noticed me watching and chuckled, a sound like gravel in a mixer. "Special blend," he said, patting the side of my fuel tank with one weathered hand. "Grows on you after a while." I thought it was just trucker humor at the time. The rain was getting heavier, and I wanted to put some miles between me and this forgotten corner of nowhere before dark. I thanked Eddie, climbed back into my cab, and fired up the engine. The cat turned over smooth as silk, purring with what seemed like unusual contentment. Sometimes you get a tank of fuel that just agrees with your engine, makes it run cleaner and stronger than usual. That's what I told myself as I pulled back onto the interstate. The first 100 miles, everything was perfect. My engine ran quieter than it had in months, the exhaust cleaner, the power delivery smooth as cream. I made good time despite the rain, my headlights cutting through the darkness as the storm finally began to move east. It wasn't until I stopped for my mandatory break at a rest area outside Lincoln that I noticed the first sign something wasn't right. While I was doing my walk-around inspection, checking tires and lights like I do every stop, I noticed something growing near my fuel tanks. At first I thought it was just mud or road grime, but when I knelt down with my flashlight I saw they were mushrooms, small pale things about the size of my thumb, clustered around the fuel tank connections like they were feeding on whatever fumes might be leaking. Fuel tanks don't leak on my rig. I maintain my equipment religiously, and I just had those connections inspected 2 weeks prior. But there they were, a dozen or more little mushrooms growing right out of the metal, their caps glistening with moisture that didn't look like rainwater. When I touched one, it felt warm, almost feverish, and it pulsed slightly under my finger like it had a heartbeat. I scraped them off with my pocket knife, telling myself it was just some kind of fungus that thrived in wet conditions, something that had attached itself to my rig during the rainstorm. But as I climbed back into my cab, I caught a whiff of something strange on the air, an earthy, organic smell that reminded me of my grandmother's root cellar, all mushrooms and decay and things growing in the dark. The next few hours passed uneventfully. I made my delivery in Omaha just after sunrise, dropped my empty trailer and headed to the truck wash to clean off the road grime. But when the high-pressure soap hit my fuel tanks, something unexpected happened. Instead of washing away, the soap seemed to make the metal itself foam and bubble, and in those bubbles, I could see more of those pale mushrooms beginning to form. The wash bay attendant, a young kid with nervous eyes, backed away from my truck like it was radioactive. "Mister," he said, his voice barely audible over the spray of water, "what kind of fuel you been running? That ain't normal." I shut off the wash and examined my tanks more closely. The mushrooms weren't just growing on the surface anymore. They were growing out of the metal itself, tiny pale fingers pushing through microscopic pores in the steel. The fuel caps, when I opened them, released a cloud of spores that made me cough and my eyes water. The diesel inside looked normal, but it smelled like a forest floor after rain, rich with the promise of growth and decay. That's when I called Eddie's Discount Fuel, using the number on the faded business card he'd given me. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. I tried directory assistance, but they had no listing for Eddie's. Even stranger, when I tried to look up the location online, I found no record of a truck stop at that mile marker on Route 287. By afternoon, the mushrooms had spread. They covered my fuel tanks like a gray-white carpet, pulsing gently in the sunlight. Other drivers at the truck stop gave my rig a wide berth, and I couldn't blame them. The smell was getting stronger too, that deep earthy odor that seemed to penetrate everything. My clothes, my cab, even the air conditioning couldn't keep it out. I tried calling mechanics, hazmat specialists, anyone who might know how to deal with whatever was happening to my truck. Most hung up when I described the situation. The few who listened told me to get my rig inspected immediately, that I might be carrying some kind of contaminated fuel. But the thing was, my engine was still running perfectly. Better than perfectly. The fuel economy was incredible, the power output steady and smooth. Whatever was in those tanks, my cat engine loved it. I began to suspect that the mushrooms weren't just growing from the fuel, they were somehow part of it, a living component that made the diesel more efficient, more potent. As the sun set and I prepared for another night of driving, I made a decision that still haunts me. I decided to head back to Eddie's to demand answers to find out what he'd sold me. The mushrooms had grown larger throughout the day, some now the size of dinner plates, their caps opening to release clouds of spores that glittered in my headlights like fairy dust. The drive back to Route 287 took me through the heart of Nebraska's farmland, past endless acres of corn and soybeans. But as I drove deeper into the night, I began to notice changes in the landscape. The crops looked different, lusher, and somehow more alive. In the beam of my headlights, I could see that the plants were interwoven with networks of pale fungal threads, like the entire countryside was connected by some vast underground web. When I finally found the location where Eddie's Discount Fuel should have been, There was nothing there but an empty lot overrun with mushrooms, huge ones, some tall as a man, their caps glowing faintly in the darkness. The pavement was cracked and broken, pushed up from below by a forest of fungi that stretched as far as my headlights could reach. I parked my rig and stepped out, my boots crunching on what I first took to be gravel but realized were thousands of tiny mushroom caps. The air was thick with spores, and each breath filled my lungs with that rich, earthy taste. In the distance, I could hear something that might have been laughter, or might have been the wind through all those pale, glistening stalks. That's when I saw Eddie, or what had been Eddie. He stood among the larger mushrooms like a scarecrow, his body covered in the same pale fungal growth that had claimed my fuel tanks. His eyes, when they met mine, were black as oil and filled with an intelligence that was no longer entirely human. "Told you it grows on you," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from the mushrooms themselves rather than his throat. "Been feeding this valley for 30 years now, one truck at a time." The Fog That Remembers, from Marcus Chen. The stretch of Highway 101 between Crescent City and Eureka has always been my favorite run, especially during those late October nights when the Pacific fog rolls in, thick as cotton batting. There's something almost hypnotic about the way my headlights cut through that white wall, the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine creating a rhythm that could lull a man to sleep if he wasn't careful. I've been hauling lumber along this coast for 15 years now, and I thought I knew every curve, every grade, every trick that highway could throw at me. But that particular night, the fog taught me that some roads keep secrets even from those who know them best. I was running about 3 hours behind schedule due to a delayed loading at the mill, which put me on the road well past midnight. The fog had started gathering around 11, just wisps at first, curling around the redwood trunks like ghostly fingers. By the time I hit the coastal stretch, it had thickened into something almost solid, reducing my visibility to maybe 20 feet ahead of my chrome bumper. I'd slowed down to a cautious 35 miles per hour, my running lights painting everything in an amber glow that seemed to get swallowed up almost immediately by that dense white curtain. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, other drivers calling out conditions and warnings about the soup we were all crawling through. But gradually, even those voices faded until there was nothing but the steady thrum of my diesel engine and the soft whisper of fog sliding over my windshield like silk. I had my wipers on intermittent, not because it was really wet, but because the fog seemed to leave this strange residue on the glass, almost like condensation but thicker somehow, more persistent. That's when I first noticed them, the handprints. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in that endless white void. But when I leaned forward and peered through my windshield more carefully, there they were, clear as day. Palm prints and finger marks pressed against the outside of my glass, as if someone had placed their hands flat against my windshield and left their mark in that strange, thick moisture the fog was depositing. The prints were small, definitely human, with delicate fingers that looked almost childlike in their proportions. I hit my wipers, and they swept the prints away in a smooth arc, but within seconds new ones appeared. Different hands this time, larger with longer fingers pressed against the passenger side of my windshield. Then more appeared on the driver's side. Overlapping each other like a crowd of invisible people were all trying to peer into my cab. The hair on the back of my neck started to prickle as I watched handprint after handprint materialize in that foggy residue. Each one distinct, each one appearing with deliberate, purposeful pressure. I told myself it was just the fog playing optical tricks, maybe some kind of atmospheric pressure thing I'd never encountered before. The coast was known for strange weather phenomena after all, but deep in my gut I knew something wasn't right. The way those prints appeared wasn't random or natural. They had intention behind them. A consciousness that made my mouth go dry and my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, if that was even possible. My headlights were barely penetrating more than 10 feet now, and everything beyond that was a white wall so dense it looked almost solid. I'd driven through plenty of fog before, but this felt different. heavier somehow, like it was pressing in on my truck from all sides with actual weight. The handprints were appearing faster now too, covering more and more of my windshield until I could barely see the road ahead through the maze of palm prints and finger marks. That's when I heard the first thump. It came from above, a soft but distinct impact on my cab roof, like someone had dropped something relatively light but solid onto the metal. I craned my neck to look up through my sunroof, but there was nothing there except that impenetrable white fog. Then another thump, this one from the trailer behind me, followed by several more in quick succession, as if things were falling from the sky and landing on my rig. But the fog was so thick I couldn't see anything above me. For all I knew, I was driving through a tunnel of white that stretched infinitely in every direction. The radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly swerved into the guardrail. But instead of another trucker's voice, all I heard was static mixed with something that sounded almost like whispers. Soft, indistinct voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I reached over to adjust the tuning, but the moment my fingers touched the dial, the sound stopped completely, leaving me in that eerie silence broken only by my engine and those continuing thumps on my roof and trailer. More handprints were appearing on my side windows now, not just my windshield. Small ones, large ones, some that looked like they belonged to children and others that seemed too big to be entirely human. They weren't just random placements either. They seemed to be following the movement of my truck, appearing in sequence from back to front as if invisible figures were walking alongside my rig and reaching out to touch it as they passed. The thought of unseen hands reaching through that fog to press against my truck made every muscle in my body tense with primitive fear. I tried reaching for my CB radio to call out to any other drivers who might be navigating this white nightmare, but when I keyed the microphone, all I got was more of that strange static filled with whispered voices. This time, though, I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences that sounded like they were coming from very far away, or maybe from very long ago. Names being called, questions being asked, voices that carried a tone of confusion and loss that made my skin crawl. The fog seemed to be moving now, swirling around my truck in patterns that definitely weren't natural. I could see it through my headlight beams, thick tendrils coiling and uncoiling like living things, reaching toward my cab with what looked disturbingly like curiosity. And wherever those fog tendrils touched my truck, more handprints appeared, dozens of them now, covering every piece of glass until my windshield looked like the window of a daycare center after recess. That's when I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle, or even a roadside marker, in over 20 minutes. Highway 101 was never completely empty, especially not this stretch that connected two major towns. Even in the thickest fog, I should have encountered at least some sign of civilization. Light poles, reflectors, maybe the glow of another vehicle's running lights penetrating that white wall. But there was nothing except that endless tunnel of fog and the growing collection of handprints covering my truck like some kind of supernatural graffiti. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to break through whatever this was and get back to normal highway. My speedometer climbed to 40, then 45, which was probably reckless in visibility this poor. But I needed to feel like I was making progress, like I was moving toward something instead of just driving through an endless white void. The engine responded with a deeper growl, but the fog seemed to thicken even more in response, as if it didn't want to let me go. The handprints were appearing so rapidly now that my wipers could barely keep up. As soon as they cleared one set, new ones would materialize, sometimes appearing so quickly I could almost see them forming in real time. Palms pressing down, fingers spreading, then lifting away to leave their mark in that strange, persistent moisture. It was like watching invisible people trying desperately to get my attention, to communicate something urgent through the only means available to them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fog didn't dissipate gradually the way fog usually does. One moment I was surrounded by that impenetrable white wall, and the next I was driving through clear night air under a star-filled sky. My headlights illuminated normal highway stretching ahead of me, complete with familiar landmarks and the comforting glow of Eureka's lights visible in the distance. I checked my mirrors and saw nothing but empty road behind me, not even a trace of the fog bank I'd just escaped. I pulled over at the next truck stop, my hands still shaking as I climbed down from my cab. The night air felt almost shockingly clear after that suffocating white tunnel, and I took several deep breaths just to convince myself I was back in the normal world. But when I walked around to check my truck, my blood ran cold. Every window, every piece of glass on my rig was covered in handprints. Not the faint moisture marks I'd been seeing during the drive, but actual prints. Clear, distinct impressions that looked like they'd been pressed into the glass itself. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering my windshield, my side windows, even the mirrors. Small hands, large hands. Hands that looked distinctly human and others that seemed somehow wrong in their proportions.